Hey guys, tonight we are going to debunk a myth so deeply ingrained in pop culture that it's practically a food group of its own, the glorious, sizzling, hearty cuisine of the American Wild West. You know the scene, a crackling campfire, cowboys gathered around, digging into plates spiraled high with juicy steak and all the fixins. Well, I'm here to tell you, you deep probably trade that entire fantasy for a single, slightly stale granola bar after just one day on the trail. The reality was less than appetizing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It's always a treat to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air in Independence, Missouri, feels thick with a mixture of possibility and manure. It's the mid-1870s, and this is at the jumping-off point. Behind your brick buildings, the clatter of a world you understand, the smell of bakeries, and the memory of your last proper meal. It was nothing special, really. Just a slice of warm bread with fresh butter and a simple bowl of vegetable soup. But as you stand here, on the cusp of the great unknown, that simple meal feels like a banquet fit for royalty. You try to commit the taste to memory, a small, warm anchor against the vast, dusty emptiness ahead. Your gaze falls upon the vehicle that will be your lifeline, your social center, and your sole source of sustenance for the next 3 months, the chuckwagon. Forget any romantic notions you have. It isn't a charming, rustic food truck. It's a repurposed, heavy-duty farm wagon, probably a Studebaker or a Murphy. It's wood-weathered, unsplintered. Its iron-rimmed wheels caked in the mud of a dozen previous journeys. This is a machine built for durability, not comfort or culinary artistry. This mobile kitchen is a marvel of rugged efficiency, a concept largely credited to the cattleman Charles Goodnight, who, in 1866, figured his drovers would be a lot less grumpy if they had a dedicated kitchen on the trail. He modified a surplus army wagon, creating the template that you see before you. At the back is the most important part, the chuck box. It's a large, upright cabinet bolted to the wagon, filled with little drawers and shelves for holding tins, spices, and tools. Its hinged lid drops down to form a work table for the cook. Tucked away are compartments for flour, beans, and coffee. Beneath the wagon, a large canvas or cowhide sling. The coney is stretched to carry firewood or, more often than not, dried cow chips, the only fuel available on the treeless plains. The whole contraption groans and creaks with every gust of wind, a constant, weary sigh. The word chuck itself is a simple bit of 19th century slang for food. So, a chuckwagon is, quite literally, the food wagon. It's a fun, little piece of linguistic history that cuts through some of the mystique. It's not named after a legendary chef named Chuck, it's just a wagon with a grub. You watch as the final supplies are loaded. Heavy sacks of flour, so dense they barely move when dropped. Crates of green coffee beans. Barrels of salt pork and dried beans. Everything is preserved, dried, or salted. There is nothing fresh, nothing green, nothing that remotely resembles the food you left behind just a few hours ago. The wagon is a fortress against hunger, but it offers no defense against monotony. As the wagon train lurches forward, leaving the last outpost of civilization behind, the reality of your choice begins to set in. The world transforms into an endless ocean of grass under a sky so big it feels intimidating. The rhythmic clatter of hooves and the squeak of axle grease become the new soundtrack to your life. The dust, kicked up by hundreds of cattle, gets into your mouth, your nose, your eyes. It coats your tongue with a fine layer of grit. Historians, by the way, are still debating whether Charles Goodnight truly invented the chuckwagon from whole cloth. Some argue that similar concepts of mobile kitchens had been used by the U.S. army or by other frontiersmen on a smaller scale. Goodnight's undeniable contribution, however, was perfecting and popularizing a design so effective and so essential that it became the absolute standard for every cattle drive across the West. He didn't just build a kitchen, he codified a way of life. The sun begins to dip low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The trail boss signals for the day's end. The wagons creak to a halt, and a collective sigh of relief seems to pass through the weary travelers. Your eyes are fixed on the chuckwagon. It's the center of this new, temporary universe. This is where the first meal of your new life will come from. And as you watch the cook begin his work, a small, gnawing question starts to form in your mind. A question you hadn't truly considered until now. What exactly are we going to eat? The man who emerges to command the chuckwagon is not what you'd call a welcoming figure. HES known universally as Cookie, or sometimes Goosey, a title that carries far more weight out here than chef ever could in a fancy restaurant. He moves with a stiff, deliberate economy of motion. His face a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles and his eyes narrowed against the ever-present dust. He doesn't smile. In fact, you're not sure the muscles required for smiling are still functional. His domain is clearly defined by an unwritten but ironclad rule. The area around the chuckwagon and its fire is his kingdom. You learn this rule the hard way. Thinking to get a better look, you take a few steps closer to the fire HES just coaxed to life from a handful of dry kindling and a few precious cow chips, without even looking up from the cast iron pot HES wrestling into place. His voice cuts through the evening air, raspy and low. That's close enough. It's not a suggestion. It's a decree. You, along with the other greenhorns, quickly learn to give him a wide berth. The seasoned cowboys already know the drill. They sit patiently on their bedrolls, a respectful distance away, watching the ritual unfold in silence. His kitchen is a study in brutal minimalism. The lowered lid of the checkbox serves as his prep table, already coated in a fine film of the day's dust. His primary tools are a few large knives, a long-handled spoon, and his most prized possession, the Dutch oven. This heavy, cast-iron pot with its tight-fitting lid is the true hero of westward expansion cooking. It can be used for baking, stewing, frying, everything. Help bury it in hot coals to create a surprisingly even, all-around heat. A primitive, but effective oven on the prairie. There's no sink. Of course, washing up consists of a bucket of murky water, maybe heated over the fire, and a quick scrub with a rag that has seen better decades. The concept of germ theory is a distant, academic rumor back east. Out here, a little grit is just extra seasoning. The cook's authority is absolute, second only to the trail boss. HES often paid more than the regular cowboys, earning around $50 to $75 a month, a handsome sum when a typical hand might only make 30. Why? Because a good cook kept the crew fed, and a fed crew was a functional crew. A bad cook, however, could lead to low morale, sickness, and even mutiny. He dictates when you eat, what you eat, and how you behave around his fire. HES the first one up in the morning, grinding coffee and starting breakfast long before the sun cracks the horizon, and the last one to bed after cleaning up from supper. His workday is relentless. Here's a little tidbit for you. The nickname Cookie probably has nothing to do with baking cookies. Most culinary historians believe the term is an Americanization of the Dutch word koch or the German kochen, meaning to cook. These terms were common among European immigrants in the U.S. Army and on merchant ships, and the slang simply drifted westward. So when you call him Cookie, you're not being cute, you're just using a century-old, borrowed term for cook. As he works, you observe his practiced movements. He hauls out a massive slab of something pale and glistening from a wooden barrel. This is salt pork, or sowbelly. It's been cured in so much salt that it's practically mummified. A method of preservation that works wonders for shelf life, but is hell on the palate. He slices off thick chunks with a cleaver, the blade thudding against the wooden prep table. Next comes a large canvas sack filled with pinto beans. He dumps a startling quantity into another pot, adds water from a barrel lashed to the side of the wagon, and sets it on the fire to boil. There's no delicate outing of aromatics here. This is survival cooking, boiled down to its most basic elements: protein, starch, and heat. While the core of his job was food, the cook often wore many other hats, though historians are still debating just how official these roles were. Was he the designated medic, dentist, and banker for a crew of 20 rough-and tumble men in many cases? Yes, he was the one with the small chest of supplies, which might contain anything from quinine for fevers to whiskey for everything else. He might be asked to pull a bad tooth with a pair of pliers, or stitch up a wound with a regular needle and thread. But whether this was a formal part of his job description, or simply a case of him being the most stationary and responsible person on the drive, is a point of academic discussion. On some drives, these tasks might have fallen to the trail boss or another experienced hand. On your drive, however, one look at Cookie's grim, competent face tells you HES, the one you to go to if you had a problem bigger than hunger. The sun has fully set now, and the campfire is the only source of light, casting long, dancing shadows. The smell of boiling beans and rendering salt pork begins to fill the air. It's not a gourmet aroma. It smells salty, fatty, and basic. Yet, after a full day of hard riding with nothing but dust in your stomach, it's also the most tantalizing scent in the world. The cowboys are starting to stir, grabbing their tin plates and cups in anticipation. Cookie ignores them all, methodically stirring the bubbling pot with his long spoon. His movements are unhurried. The meal will be ready when he decides it's ready, and not a second sooner. You shift your weight on the hard ground, your stomach rumbling in a way that feels both primal and profound. Your first taste of the real West is just moments away. The call comes without ceremony. Grab a plate, Cookie grunts, and it's a signal that unleashes a quiet, orderly stampede. You follow the lead of the veteran cowboys, picking up a tin plate, a tin cup, and a cheap metal fork from a crate nailed to the side of the chuckwagon. There are no tables, no chairs. You find a spot on the hard-packed earth, cross-legged, balancing your plate on your knees. This is your dining room for the foreseeable future. You fall past the fire, and Cookie slops a ladle FULFs beans onto your plate. They're a grayish-brown color, swimming in a thick, starchy liquid. Next to the beans, he places a few strips of the salt pork you saw him slicing earlier. It's been fried in a skillet and is now a shriveled, intensely brown, and slightly greasy curl of meat. Finally, he gestures with his spoon toward a pile of what look like large, flat, pale discs. Biscuits, he says, though the word seems entirely inadequate for what you're seeing. You take one. It's heavy in your hand, dense and cool to the touch. And that's it. That's the Western feast. A scoop of beans, a strip of sowbelly, and a biscuit. You make your way back to your spot on the ground, the plate feeling surprisingly heavy. The final element of the meal is the coffee. You hold out your tin cup, and Cookie pours a thick, black, steaming liquid into it from a massive, soot-blackened coffee pot that seems to be a permanent fixture on the fire. You take your first bite. Let's start with the beans. The first sensation is salt, an overwhelming, tongue-curling wave of it. The beans themselves are soft, mushy, and utterly devoid of any flavor beyond their own starchy essence and the salt they were boiled with. There's no hint of chili, no garlic, no onion. It is simply boiled beans. You understand now why they were sometimes called prairie strawberries or whistleberries. It was a desperate attempt to inject a little humor into the sheer, soul-crushing monotony of it all. Next, you try the sowbelly. It's tough, incredibly tough. Your fork can barely pierce it. You pick it up with your fingers and take a bite. The salt hits you again, even more intensely than with the beans. It's a preserved flavor, a chemical taste that speaks of long months in a barrel. Beneath the salt, there's a dense, chewy texture and the flavor of rendered pork fat. It's not a pleasant, crispy piece of bacon. It's a leathery shard of pure survival fuel. It's calorie-dense and won't spoil, which is its only virtue. Finally, the biscuit. You try to break a piece off, but it resists. This isn't a light, fluffy buttermilk biscuit. This is a sourdough biscuit, or a pan biscuit, made with the simplest of ingredients: flour, water, a little salt, and a bit of leavening from the cook's precious sourdough starter. It's been cooked in a greased Dutch oven, so the bottom is slightly browned and oily, but the inside is dense, doughy, and heavy. It tastes of flour, but not much else. It serves as a vehicle, a starchy shovel to scoop up the beans and sop up the grease from the pork. It fills your stomach, which is its primary and sole purpose. This cord-eyed beef, beans, and biscuits or bacon was the unholy trinity of the trail. The sheer lack of variety is something modern minds can barely comprehend. You wouldn't just have this for dinner. You'd have a variation of it for breakfast, and again for supper, day after day, week after week, for months on end. The only thing that changed was how tired you were of it. Here's a curious little detail about trail dining etiquette. Cowboys developed a system for getting seconds. You would never, ever take the last of anything from the pot. It was considered extremely bad form. If you wanted more, you'd ask the cook, "Is there any more in the pot?" If there was, he'd nod, and you could help yourself. But if you were the one to scrape the pot clean, you were expected to be the one to wash it. Since no one wanted that job, that last scoop of beans would often sit there, a silent, greasy testament to cowboy courtesy. As you chew your leathery pork, you look around at the other men. They eat with a quiet, focused intensity. There's no conversation, no savoring of flavors. It's a refueling process. Food is a necessity, not a pleasure. The only sound is the clinking of forks against tin plates and the occasional slurp of coffee. The coffee. You take a sip from your tin cup and immediately recoil. It's scalding hot, incredibly bitter, and so strong it feels like it could dissolve the metal of the cup. There's no sugar, no cream. This is cowboy coffee, made by boiling coarse grounds directly in the water. To settle the grounds, the cook might toss in a crushed eggshell or a splash of cold water, a technique that worked with varying degrees of success. Often, the last sip was a mouthful of bitter grit, yet it was the most important part of the meal. It was hot, it was energizing, and it cut through the grease and salt of the food. It was the one small comfort in a world of discomfort. Historians are still in a bit of a debate about the exact recipes and the subtle variations in trail cooking. Did some cooks use wild onions or other herbs they found along the way? Almost certainly, when they could. Was the quality of the food on a well-funded, well-organized cattle doctor significantly better than on a shoestring operation? Absolutely. But the fundamental truth remains: the diet was built around a handful of non-perishable, high-calorie staples. The romantic image of a diverse and hearty chuckwagon meal is largely a Hollywood invention. The reality, as you're now discovering, was far more bland. You finish your meal, your stomach full but your palate deeply unsatisfied. You stare into the dregs of your coffee, wondering how many more meals like this you can possibly endure. You assumed, like most people, that the term cattle doctor implied a steady supply of fresh beef. The image is practically embedded in the collective consciousness. A cowboy carves a thick, juicy steak from a steer that was, just hours before, part of the herd. You imagine it sizzling over an open flame, the very essence of the American West. Now, sitting by the fire, you learn the hard, sinewy truth. The cattle you are driving are not for eating. Not yet. They are walking gold, the primary asset of the entire operation. Every single head that is lost to rustlers, to stampedas, to sickness, or to the dinner plate is money walking out of the owner's pocket. The trail boss's job is to get as many of these animals to the railhead in Kansas or Wyoming as possible. Eating the merchandise was an act of last resort, reserved for dire emergencies, like if a steer broke a leg and had to be put down. The beef you do eat on the trail comes from a different source. It's often jerked, a term derived from the Spanish word charqui. This isn't the tender, flavorful jerky you buy in a bag today. This is a survival food. The process was simple and brutal. Meat, often from older, tougher animals not fit for the main herd, was cut into thin strips, salted heavily, and left to dry in the hot sun and wind, sometimes draped over the side of the wagon. The result was a rock-hard, moisture-less strip of protein that could last for months without spoiling. To make it edible, Cookie has to boil it for hours, reconstituting it into a stringy, chewy substance that he throws into the bean pot. This is your steak dinner. The cattle themselves, the famous Texas Longhorns, were not bred for their succulent meat. They were bred for their hardness. These were magnificent, semi-wild creatures with horns that could span 6 feet or more. They could survive on sparse prairie grass, walk for hundreds of miles, and defend themselves against predators. But their meat, it was notoriously lean, tough, and stringy. The concept of marbled, tender beef from breeds like Angus or Hereford was a luxury of the future, a something that would only become common after the West was settled and ranching became more sophisticated. One of the more bizarre and frankly unappetizing dishes that might appear was something called son of a gun stew. This was the meal you got when an animal did have to be slaughtered on the trail, and in the spirit of not wasting a single scrap, the stew contained, well, everything: the heart, the liver, the tongue, the kidneys, and even the marrow, gut, the long to buff marrow from the backbone. All of it was chopped up and boiled in a pot, seasoned heavily with whatever was on hand. The name itself is a polite euphemism. The cowboys often called it son of a bitch stew, because it was said to contain every part of the calf but the hide, horns, and holler. It was a gritty, organ-heady concoction that was either a welcome change from the monotony or a culinary nightmare, depending on your disposition. As you sit there, chewing on a piece of reconstituted jerky that has the texture of boiled leather, you can't help but feel a pang of disappointment. This is the great American beef experience, says Alti. Fibrous protein added to a pot of bland beans. Here's a little-known fact that adds another layer of grim reality to the story. A significant portion of the preserved meat consumed in the West wasn't even beef. It was pork. Salt pork, or sowbelly, was cheaper, easier to preserve in barrels of brine, and had a higher fat content, which meant more calories, a crucial factor for men doing hard manual labor all day. Beef was the symbol of the West, but pork was often the fuel that kept it running. The historical debate on this topic often revolves around the frequency of fresh meat on the trail. Some diaries and accounts from cowboys mention hunting for game like antelope, deer, or rabbit to supplement their diet. No doubt this happened, and it would have been a welcome relief. But was it a regular occurrence? Many historians argue that for the average cowboy on a massive cattle drive, time was money. Stopping to hunt was a luxury the trail boss couldn't always afford. The primary job was to move the herd. Therefore, for most of the journey, the diet would have remained stubbornly reliant on the preserved contents of the chuckwagon. The idea of cowboys regularly feasting on wild game might be another one of those romantic embellishments, a story told more often in dime novels than it happened in reality. You look out at the herd, a sea of horns and hides shifting restlessly in the moonlight. They are beautiful, intimidating, and completely inedible. They represent a future feast for someone else, in a city far away. For you, here and now, they are just part of the landscape, a dusty, moving backdrop to your meal of boiled jerky and beans. The sizzle of the steak you imagined has been replaced by the quiet, persistent chewing required to break down a piece of sun-dried meat. It's a humbling realization. On the American frontier, even when surrounded by thousands of cattle, A good piece of beef was one of the hardest things to find. The sun rises, and with it, the familiar smell of boiling beans. For breakfast, you had hoped, in some small, naive part of your soul, that morning would bring a different menu. It does not. The beans are there, perhaps a little thicker and MUS higher from being reheated. They sit on your plate next to a piece of fried salt pork and another one of those heavy, doughy biscuits. The only difference is the time of day. This is the beginning of the bean POCALAPSE. The pinto bean was the undisputed king of the trail. It was cheap, easy to transport in huge quantities, and packed with protein. A single 100-pound sack could provide hundreds of meals. For the cattle barons financing the drive, this made perfect economic sense. For you, the person eating them 3 times a day, it is a slow descent into a very specific kind of culinary madness. You quickly learn the many names cowboys had for them, each one a small monument to their gallows humor. Mexican strawberries, prairie strawberries, or desert strawberries, sarcastic nods to a fruit they would not see for months. They were also called whistleberries, a more direct reference to their well-known digestive side effects. In a camp of 20 men subsisting on a diet of beans, the evening air around the campfire could get musical. The preparation never varies. The beans are soaked if the cook has the time and forethought, but often they are just dumped into a pot with water and salt and boiled until they are soft. Sometimes, chunks of the jerked beef or salt pork are thrown in, creating a rudimentary stew. This dish, often called skilly, was the backbone of every meal. It was shoveled onto your plate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Any leftovers from dinner were put back on the fire to simmer overnight, ready to be served again in the morning. The pot was never truly empty. It was a perpetual stew, constantly replenished with new beans, new water, and more salt. You start to notice the subtle, and not so subtle, effects of this diet. There's a constant, heavy feeling in your gut. The sheer volume of beans and heavy biscuits is filling, but it's a dead weight, providing calories without much in the way of actual nutrition beyond protein and carbs. You begin to crave freshness, the crisp snap of a rock carrot, the juicy burst of an apple. These memories become almost tortuous fantasies. You'd trade a month's pay for a simple salad. Here's a strange little fact that most people don't know. The cowboys' relationship with beans was so iconic that it became a point of pride. In later years, as the open range era was ending, old-timers would almost boast about the terrible food they had endured. The ability to stomach endless beans became a badge of honor, a sign that you were a true, hardened cowboy of the old school. It was a form of shared hardship that bonded them together. They might complain about it at the time, but in retrospect, the bean and biscuit diet was central to their identity. The monotony is the real enemy. It grinds you down more than the dust or the saddle sores. Your brain ceases to register the taste. Eating becomes a mechanical act of shoveling fuel into your body. You experiment with ways to make it different. You try mashing the beans against the side of your plate with your fork. You try wrapping them in a piece of biscuit. You try eating the pork first, then the beans. Nothing works. It all tastes the same salty, mushy, beige flavor profile, meal after meal. One of the great debates among food historians of the West is whether chili powder or any other spices were commonly used on the trail. The answer is complex. Chili, as a cultivated crop into spice, was certainly a staple in the Southwest and in Mexican cuisine. It's highly likely that on cattle drives originating from South Texas, cooks with a background in Taino culture would have used chili peppers to flavor the eternal bean pot. This would have made a world of difference. However, on drives starting from Central Texas or other parts of the West, and with cooks from different backgrounds, such spices would have been a rare luxury. The standard chuckwagon, as conceived by Charles Goodnight, was stocked with the basic salt, flour, coffee, beans. Anything more exotic was an exception, not the rule. so your chances of getting a flavorful bowl of chili spiced beans were largely a matter of geographical luck. Judging by the bland mush on your plate, you were not lucky. The psychological toll is fascinating. Food is more than sustenance, it's comfort. It's variety. It's a marker of time. When every meal is the same, the days begin to blur into one long, continuous grind. You lose track of whether it's Tuesday or Friday. The only thing that marks the passage of time is the position of the sun in the sky and the ever-present pot of beans, bubbling away over the fire. It's the first thing you see in the morning and the last thing you see at night. It's the alpha and the omega of your existence, a bland, brown, bubbling deity to which you must pay tribute 3 times a day. You are in bean hell, and there is no escape. Let's talk about the other cornerstone of your diet, the biscuit. Forget everything you know about that word. Erase the images of fluffy, layered, buttermilk goodness. Banish the thought of warm, crumbly scones. A thing sitting on your plate, next to the beans and sowbelly, is a different beast entirely. It's a hardtack biscuit, and its primary selling point is that it's almost indestructible. You pick it up, it has a surprising heft, a solid, disc-like weight. The surface is smooth and pale, pockmarked with a few small ducker holes, which are there to prevent it from puffing up during baking. You tap it against your tin plate, and it makes a sharp, dense clack, like a piece of wood. This is not food in the traditional sense. This is a flour and water-based brick designed for maximum shelf life and minimum palatability. Hardtack was a military staple long before it found its way onto the prairie. It was known by soldiers in the Civil War by a variety of grimly humorous names: sheet iron crackers, toothed Dolores, and, most evocatively, worm castles, for reasons that will become unpleasantly clear later. The recipe is simplicity itself: flour, water, and maybe a little salt. That's it. The dough is mixed, rolled out thick, cut into squares or rounds, and baked until it is bone dry and hard as a rock. The goal is to remove every last bit of moisture, making it impervious to mold and drought. The properly made piece of hardtack could, in theory, last for decades. You try to take a bite. It's a mistake. Your teeth meet the unyielding surface and you feel a jarring sensation shoot through your jaw. You could genuinely break a tooth on this stuff. The cowboys knew this. No one ate hardtack dry, unless they were really desperate. The standard procedure, which you now adopt, is to drop it into your cup of scalding hot coffee. You watch as the hardtack sinks slowly into the black liquid, releasing a few lazy bubbles. After a minute or two, you fish it out with your fork. It's now transformed into a soggy, slightly swollen mass. The texture is like wet cardboard, and the flavor is, well, what you'd expect: boiled flour, with the bitter aftertaste of cheap coffee. But it's soft enough to chew, and it fills your stomach. That's a win. Another common method was to smash it into smaller pieces with the butt of a pistol or a rock, then toss the crumbs into the bean pot to thicken the stew. The hardtack became a starchy, flavorless dumpling, adding bulk and calories to the meal. Now, about those worm castles. Because hardtack was stored for long periods in wooden crates and sacks, it was a prime target for weevils and other insects. It was incredibly common to break open a piece of hardtack and find it riddled with little tunnels and bugs. This was so routine that it barely elicited a reaction. The general practice was to tap the biscuit on a rock to knock out the living weevils. As for the ones that were already baked in or dead inside, well, that was just extra protein. The old saying among soldiers and cowboys was, "It's better to eat it in the dark. What you couldn't see couldn't hurt you." This brings us to a weirdly fascinating bit of food science. You'd think that something as simple as a hard biscuit would be universal, but there were regional variations. The hardtack you're eating is more common to military rations and pioneers coming from the north. On a cattle drive, you were more likely to encounter its slightly more sophisticated cousin, the sorter, or pan biscuit. While still dense and heavy compared to a modern biscuit, it was at least leavened with a sourdough starter, giving it a bit of a lift and a tangy flavor. These were freshly baked in the Dutch oven every day or two, so they were softer and less likely to be infested with weevils. Still, if supplies of starter or flour ran low, Cookie would resort to making unleavened cowboy bread, which was essentially a large, thin, fried hardtack crispy, greasy disc of flour and water. The historical debate here often centers on just how bad these biscuits really were. Were they universally the tooth-breaking hardtack of military lore, or were they more often the softer, daily bakes or the variety? The answer, as with most things in the West, is it depends. It depended on the skill of the cook, the quality of the supplies, the length of the journey, and the specific traditions of that outfit. Some cowboys' memoirs praise their cook's light, wonderful biscuits, while others complain endlessly about indigestible dough balls. The truth is likely a spectrum. Your particular cook, it seems, is a master of the indigestible dough ball school of baking. You finish your soggy, coffee-infused biscuit, the bland, pasty texture coating your tongue. You look at the remaining hardtack in the supply crate. There are hundreds of them, a beige arsenal against starvation. They are a promise that you will not go hungry. They are also a threat that your meals will never be enjoyable. It's a strange kind of comfort. The comfort of knowing that your future holds an endless supply of edible rocks. You take another sip of your gritty coffee and try not to think about it too much. You lower your cup. The bitter, gritty dregs coating the back of your throat. This black, syrupy liquid in your tin cup is more than just a beverage. It's the engine of the entire cattle drive. It's medicine. It's the morale booster. It is, without exaggeration, the lifeblood of the cowboy. The coffee you're drinking bears no resemblance to the artisanal, single-origin pour-over you might dream of. This is Arbuckle's, a Rio Say coffee, and it was a revolution in a cup. Before the Arbuckle brothers came along, cowboys had to buy green coffee beans. This meant they had to roast them over the campfire themselves, a tricky process that often resulted in beans that were either burned and bitter or underdeveloped and grassy. It was a constant source of frustration. Then, in the post-Civil War era, John and Charles Arbuckle of Pittsburgh pioneered a process for selling pre-roasted coffee beans in 1-pound sealed packages. This was a game changer. It ensured a consistent, reliable roast every single time. But their true stroke of genius was an egg and sugar glaze they applied to the beans after roasting. This glaze sealed in the flavor and aroma, protecting the beans from the air and humidity. For a chuckwagon cook, this was a godsend. Arbuckles became so dominant in the West that cowboys didn't ask for coffee, they asked for arbuckles. The preparation is a ritual you watch every morning and evening. Cookie takes a handful of the roasted beans from the bag and puts them in a cloth sack. Then, he takes the butt of his pistol or a heavy rock and smashes them. He's not grinding them, he's pulverizing them into a coarse, uneven powder. This powder is then dumped directly into the massive coffee pot, which is already half full of water from the previous batch. He adds more water, sets it on the fire, then lets it boil, and boil, and boil. The goal is not to extract delicate flavor notes. The goal is maximum caffeine extraction and maximum heat. Cowboy coffee is boiled until it's a thick, potent, almost viscous brew. The old joke was that a proper cup of cowboy coffee was one where you could float a horseshoe or a pistol in it. After it has boiled for a sufficient amount of time, Cookie takes it off the fire to settle the grounds that are churning around inside. He might employ one of a few tricks. The most common was to add a splash of cold water, which would cause the grounds to sink to the bottom. A more sophisticated cook might save eggshells from a rare breakfast treat and toss them in. The shells would attract the grounds and carry them to the bottom. Regardless of the method, the result is a cup of coffee that is brutally strong, intensely bitter, and often still contains a fair amount of mud in the bottom. There is no sugar. There is no cream. You drink it black and you drink it hot. Here's a fun little perk that made arbuckles even more popular inside every 1-pound bag of coffee. There was a single stick of peppermint candy for men living on a diet of salt and starch. This small, sweet treat was an unbelievable luxury. It was a burst of sugar, a flash of flavor in a bland world. Cowboys would trade, gamble, and fight over those peppermint sticks. It was a brilliant marketing move that created a fierce loyalty to the brand. You take another sip. The bitterness makes you wince. But a moment later, a wave of warmth spreads through your chest. The caffeine hits your system like a jolt of lightning. Your senses sharpen. The weariness in your bones from a long day in the saddle begins to recede. Now you understand. The coffee isn't about taste. It's about function. It wakes you up in the freezing pre-dawn dark. It warms you up when the prairie wind cuts through your jacket. It helps you digest the heavy, greasy meal in your stomach. And it provides a focal point for the camp's social life. Men would gather around the fire, tin cups in hand, and the shared ritual of drinking the harsh brew was a form of communion. The academic debate here often revolves around the true chemical kick of this coffee. Some food scientists argue that boiling the coffee for so long would actually break down some of the caffeine molecules, making it less potent than a modern, properly brewed cup. However, the sheer volume of coffee grounds used was so immense compared to the water that even if the extraction method was inefficient, the resulting brew was still incredibly concentrated. Furthermore, the psychological effect was undeniable. In a world of deprivation, this hot, bitter drink felt powerful. Whether it was a placebo effect or a genuine caffeine bomb is, to some extent, irrelevant. For the cowboy on the trail, it worked. You cradle the warm tin cup in your hands. It's your personal furnace against the vast, cold emptiness of the plains. The coffee is terrible, but it's a necessary terrible. It's the fuel that gets you back in the saddle at 4 in the morning. It's the bitter punctuation mark at the end of another identical day. As you drain the last of the liquid, carefully avoiding the sludge at the bottom, you feel a grudging respect for this awful, wonderful brew. It might be the worst coffee you've ever had, but out here, it's also the best. Amidst the relentless onslaught of salt, grease, and boiled flour blandness, a hero emerges. It's not a person or a spice, but a living, breathing, bubbling entity that Cookie guards with his life. It's the sourdough starter. This small keg or crock, often nestled in a warm spot near the chuck box, contains a symbiotic culture of wild yeast and bacteria. It's a living leavening agent, a bubbling pot of potential that offers the only real variation to the otherwise static menu. The cook starter was his most valuable possession, often more so than his knives or his Dutch oven. A good starter, passed down through generations of cooks, was a point of immense pride. You watch Cookie one morning as he tends to it. He opens the crock, and a distinct, tangy, slightly alcoholic smell wafts into the cool air. The surface of the grayish, gloppy mixture is covered in bubbles. It's alive. He feeds it by adding a scoop of flour and a splash of water from the barrel, stirring it with a wooden spoon. He then takes a portion of the now active starter to make the day's biscuits. This is what separates a dreaded hardtack from a merely tolerable pan biscuit. The wild yeast in the starter consumes the sugars in the flour and releases carbon dioxide gas, creating bubbles that give the dough a slight lift and a more tender crumb. The flavor it imparts is its real magic. That characteristic tangy, sour taste cuts through the monotonous, salty flavor of the sowbelly and beans. Ace, or dough biscuit, even a dense, heavy one, tastes of something. It has character. It's a small spark of complexity in a world of overwhelming simplicity. This simple fermented flour and water mixture was incredibly versatile. The cook could use it for more than just biscuits. On a good day, he might make flapjacks, thick, sour pancakes cooked in bacon grease on a skillet. Receiving a stack of these for breakfast felt like a holiday. They were still heavy, still greasy, but they were a different shape and texture, and that alone was a cause for celebration. Sometimes, The cook would bake a sourdough bread, a larger loaf baked in the Dutch oven that would last for a couple of days. A slice of this, even stale, was a welcome change. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates how important the starter was. The cook had to protect it from the elements like it was a fragile child. In the freezing cold of winter or at high altitudes, he would wrap the crock in blankets and keep it inside the wagon. Some stories even claim that on brutally cold nights, the cook would take his starter crock to bed with him, using his own body heat to keep the precious yeast culture from freezing and dying. Losing your starter on the trail was a catastrophe. It meant a return to unleavened, rock-hard bread until you could bake daru, or cultivate a new one from scratch, a process that could take days. The origins of sourdough in the West are often linked to the gold miners of the California Gold Rush, who were nicknamed Sourdough West because of their reliance on this leavening. They carried their starters with them everywhere, a tangible link to their last decent meal and a promise for their next. The tradition migrated from the mining camps to the cattle trails, becoming an indispensable part of frontier cooking. The science behind why sourdough was so perfect for the trail is fascinating, and it's something that historians and food scientists are still exploring. Was its prevalence merely due to the lack of commercial yeast, or was there more to it? One compelling theory is that the acidity of the starter acted as a natural preservative. The lactic and acetic acids produced by the bacteria helped to inhibit the growth of mold and other spoilage microbes. In a world without refrigeration, a bread that stayed fresh for an extra day or two was a significant advantage. Furthermore, some research suggests that the fermentation process begins to break down the complex carbohydrates in the flour, making the bread slightly easier to digest. For men living on a heavy, gut-busting diet, this could have made a real difference. The debate continues on how much these benefits were understood at the time versus how much was just happy accident. Tonight, Cookie has outdone himself. HES made a large pan of sourdough biscuits, and they're lighter than usual. You break one open, and the steam that rises carries that familiar, comforting sour smell. It's still a heavy, dense piece of bread by any modern standard, but compared to the hardtack you endured last week, it's a culinary masterpiece. You use it to scoop up your beans, and the tangy flavor of the biscuit provides a perfect counterpoint to the salty mush. It's a small thing, a tiny detail in the grand, harsh tapestry of the trail, but it makes the meal feel almost pleasant. You finish your biscuit, feeling a sense of gratitude towards that little crock of bubbling goo. It's a testament to human ingenuity, to the ability to create flavor and comfort from the simplest possible ingredients. In the bleak landscape of Western cuisine, the sourdough starter was a tiny, persistent spark of life and flavor, a humble but powerful reminder that even in the harshest conditions, a little bit of magic can be coaxed from just flour and water. The rhythm of the trail has become your reality, a monotonous cycle of ride, eat, sleep, repeat. But today, something is different. The chuckwagon, which rumbled to a halt last night, is disturbingly low on a few key supplies. The bean sack is looking limp, and the flour barrel is more echo than powder. The trail boss, after a grim-faced conference with Cookie, makes an announcement the next supply point is still for days out, further than they decalculated. They need to stretch the rations. This means two things for you. First, your already meager portions are about to get even smaller. Second, for the first time, you're forced to look at the endless prairie not as an obstacle to be crossed, but as a potential pantry. Under Cookie's reluctant guidance, you and a few other hands are tasked with foraging. "Don't bring me nothing, that'll kill us," is his only instruction. It's not exactly reassuring. You dismount, leaving the relative comfort of the saddle to scour the dry, dusty earth for anything green and edible. The task is daunting. To your untrained eye, the prairie is a uniform sea of brown grass and thorny bushes. But slowly, with a few pointers from a seasoned cowboy who grew up in this territory, you start to see the details. You learn to spot the broad, flat leaves of the wild onion, Plucking one from the ground and crushing it between your fingers releases a sharp, familiar, and utterly glorious scent. It's the first fresh, non-salty aroma you've smelled in weeks. You gather them greedily, stuffing them into a canvas sack. Next, you find a patch of what the cowboys call prairie potatoes or Indian breadroot. It's a plant with a long, starchy root that, when peeled and boiled, has a texture similar to a turnip. It's bland, but it's a source of carbohydrates that isn't flour. Digging them out of the hard, sun-baked soil is back-breaking work, but the thought of something new in the stew pot is a powerful motivator. You also learn about the prickly pear cactus. Its pods, or no peels, can be eaten if you painstakingly burn or scrape off all the tiny, vicious spines. Its fruit, the vibrant red tuna, is sweet and juicy, a shocking burst of flavor on your dust-coated tongue. It's a dangerous harvest. One wrong move and your hand is full of hair like gelock-ids that will torment you for days, but the reward is immense. This is the reality of living off the land. It's not a romantic adventure of hunting and gathering a bounty. It's a slow, difficult, and often disappointing task. For every patch of edible onions, you find a dozen mysterious plants that could be either a delicacy or a deadly poison. There's no app to identify them, no guidebook. You rely on passed-down folk knowledge, which is often incomplete or contradictory. Here's a fascinatedly weird food source that was sometimes on the menu: cattles. The lung, reedy plants that grow in marshy areas were surprisingly versatile. The young shoots could be peeled and eaten like asparagus. The roots could be ground into a type of flour, and the pollen from the familiar brown cattle head could be used to thicken stews or even make a kind of pancake. It was a genuine wild supermarket, if you knew where to look and weren't afraid of getting your boots muddy. The academic controversy in this area is significant. How much did the average cowboy or pioneer actually rely on foraging? Some historical accounts and dime novels paint a picture of frontiersmen who were expert botanists, able to thrive on the natural bounty of the land. However, many historians push back against this. They argue that the knowledge of local flora was highly specialized, often held more by Native American tribes and early settlers than by transient cowboys. A drover from East Texas would have little to no knowledge of the plants in the high plains of Wyoming. Foraging was likely an act of desperation, not a regular dietary supplement. The risk of accidentally eating something toxic was very real, and a trail boss couldn't afford to have half his crew sick from a misidentified root. Tonight, the stew pot is different. Your scavenged onions have been chopped and thrown in with the last of the beans. The prairie potatoes are boiling alongside them. The flavor is transformed. The sharp bite of the onion cuts through the salt and starch, adding a layer of complexity that has been absent for so long. It's still a humble, watery stew, but it tastes alive. It tastes like the land itself. For dessert, Cookie has stewed some of the prickly pear fruit, creating a sweet, pulpy, magenta-colored sauce. He slaps a spoonful of it onto your tin plate. It's not pretty, but the taste is sublime. It's a pure, natural sweetness, a welcome shock to a palate deadened by salt and sourdough. As you eat, you look out at the prairie with new eyes. It's no longer a monotonous void. It's a landscape of hidden resources, a place of subtle and dangerous secrets. You have, for one day, participated in the ancient human act of gathering food from the wild. It gives you a profound sense of respect for the people who truly mastered this environment, who could read the land like a book. It also gives you a profound sense of relief that a supply town is, hopefully, just a few days away. Foraging is hard work. Then you trade it all for a guaranteed sack of beans and a heartbeat. Weeks have passed on the trail. The cattle drive is over. You've been paid, and the dust of the trail still feels permanently etched into your skin. Instead of signing on for another drive, you've decided to try a different kind of frontier life. You've joined a family of homesteaders, settlers who have claimed a plot of land under the Homestead Act of 1862. hoping to carve a farm out of the wild prairie. You've traded the chuckwagon for a sod house, a dwelling built from bricks of prairie turf. It's dark, perpetually damp, and smells of earth, and its kitchen makes the chuckwagon look like a palace of modern convenience. You are now in the world of the pioneer family, and the struggle for food has taken on a new, more permanent dimension. There is no trail boss to worry about supplies, no cookie to perform the daily ritual of cooking. There is only a husband and wife, a few children, and you, their hired hand, all staring down the long, unforgiving winter. The kitchen is the center of this one-room sod house. It consists of a small, cast-iron stove, a rough-hewn wooden table, and a few shelves holding a meager collection of supplies. The food they have is what they could carry in their wagon and what they've managed to grow in their first, fledgling garden. The staples are comfortingly familiar: flour, cornmeal, salt pork, and a small sack of beans. But here, they are not just supplies for a journey, they are the entirety of their wealth. A thin wall standing between them and starvation. You watch the homesteader's wife, a woman whose hands are chapped and rough but whose movements are deft and practiced. Her daily life is a testament to culinary ingenuity born of scarcity. She makes a dish called corn piwan, a simple, unleavened cornbread made from cornmeal, water, and salt, often cooked in bacon grease in a skillet on the stove. It's crumbly, dense, and has a gritty texture, but it's filling and a change from the flour-based biscuits of the trail. Another staple is mush. This is simply cornmeal boiled with water, or, on a rare good day, milk from their single, freshest cow. It's served for breakfast, hot and steaming. Any leftovers are allowed to cool and solidify in a pan. The solid, congealed mush is then sliced, fried in lard, and served for dinner. Nothing is wasted. Every calorie is hoarded and repurposed. The garden is their hope and their heartbreak. They've managed to grow some hardy vegetables, potatoes, turnips, and a few rows of tough, leafy greens. But the grasshoppers came in swarms, devouring half the crop. A late frost killed the delicate squash blossoms. What remains is harvested with a reverence you've never witnessed before. Every single potato is treated like a nugget of gold. Estimate with a few small, homegrown potatoes and a handful of greens feels like a feast of unprecedented luxury. Here's a peculiar dish that illustrates the desperation and creativity of the homesteader: kitchen vinegar pie. In a world without fresh fruit, pioneers craved the sweetened tart flavors of a fruit pie. To replicate it, they invented a mock apple pie or desperation pie. The filling was made from a mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, and, crucially, apple cider vinegar. The vinegar provided the tartness that mimicked fresh apples, baked in a simple flour crust. The result was a surprisingly convincing and delicious substitute for the real thing. It was a culinary illusion, a sweet memory conjured from the barest of cupboards. The historical debate around the pioneer diet often centers on the idea of self-sufficiency. Was the classic homesteader truly a self-sufficient farmer who lived entirely off their own land? The romantic image says yes. The reality, as many historians argue, was far more complex. Most homesteaders were desperately dependent on cash crops, a single crop like wheat or corn that they could sell to earn money to buy the things they couldn't produce: sugar, coffee, salt, tools, and textiles. A single failed crop could mean not just a lean winter, but financial ruin and the loss of their land. The self-sufficient pioneer is largely a myth. They were deeply embedded in a cash economy, often living on the knife's edge of debt and foreclosure. You witnessed this firsthand. The family is saving every penny to buy a new plow blade and more seeds for next year. This means there is no money for coffee, no money for sugar. The salt pork is used so sparingly a single slab has to last a month. The meals are a rotation of corn piwan, mush, and boiled potatoes. The flavor profile is relentlessly starchy and bland. One evening, the eldest son comes home from hunting, not with a deer or an antelope, but with 2 squirrels. The mood in the sod house lifts instantly. The squirrels are skinned, cleaned, and thrown into the stew pot. The resulting meal is thin and bony, the meat stringy, but it's a welcome infusion of protein and flavor. It's a reminder that survival here depends on a combination of back-breaking farm labor and opportunistic hunting and gathering. You sit at the rough table, eating your small portion of squirrel stew and corn pewan. The flickering lamplight casts deep shadows on the faces of the family. They eat in silence, not out of grimness, but with a quiet focus. This food, as meager as it is the product of their sweat, their struggle, their unwavering and almost unbelievable hope. It's a different kind of terrible food than what you had on the trail. That was the food of transience. This is the food of endurance. And in its own way, it's even more humbling. Your homesteading experiment is over. The relentless toil and isolation of the prairie have driven you back towards the clumsy, chaotic semblance of civilization, a dusty, one-street cattle town. It's a riot of noise and humanity after the profound silence of the plains. Horses are tied to hitching posts. Wagons rattle down the upaved street, and the tinny sound of a piano spills out from a swinging set of saloon doors. It's here, in this hub of weary cowboys, opportunistic merchants, and hopeful prospectors, that you encounter a new frontier in terrible food. Drawn by the promise of a drink and a change of scenery, you push through the swinging doors of the largest saloon in town. The air inside is thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and unwashed bodies. A long wooden bar dominates one wall, and a few rough tables are scattered around the sawdust-covered floor. But what catches your eye is a sign, hand-painted and hung crookedly behind the bar, FRELUNCH. Free after months of food being the most valuable and scarce commodity in your life. The word seems alien, impossible. You see it with your own eyes. A small section of the bar is covered with a grimy-looking cloth, upon which sit several platters of food. It's a modest spread, but it's there for the taking, as long as you buy a 5-cent beer or a 10-cent whiskey. It's the original happy hour, a marketing tactic to lure in thirsty customers and keep them drinking. You buy a beer and sidle up to the free lunch counter to inspect the offerings. It's a rogues gallery of 19th century bar snacks. There's a bowl of pickled eggs, floating in a cloudy, mysterious brine. There's a plate of crackers, likely the same tooth-dulling hardtack you remember from the trail, perhaps softened slightly by the humid air of the saloon. There's a hunk of cheese, dark yellow and sweating under the heat of the room, with a communal knife resting beside it. And then there's the centerpiece, a large, shallow pan of what looks like sliced meat, swimming in a thin, brownish gravy. You tentatively spear a piece of the meat with your fork. It's soft, with a slightly rubbery texture. The taste is ambiguous. It's salty, and it has a faint, game-y flavor you can't quite place. What is this stuff, the truth, which you learn from a garrulous old-timer at the bar, is that saloon lunch meat was the great mystery of the West. It was, in short, whatever was cheap and available. It could be leftover cuts of beef or pork from the local butcher, too tough or undesirable for regular sale. It might be heavily salted and boiled tongue, a common and inexpensive cut, but often it was a medley of smaller game. Squirrel, rabbit, and prairie dog were frequent ingredients, trapped or shot by local boys who would sell them to the saloon keeper for a few pennies. The animals were skinned, boiled until tender, and then drowned in a salty gravy designed to mask any questionable flavors or textures. You could be eating anything, and it was generally better not to ask. One of the more bizarre and frankly disgusting items that sometimes appeared on a free lunch counter was pickled herring or other preserved fish. In the middle of a dusty, landlocked cattle town, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean, you could find barrels of cheap, salt-cured fish shipped in by the railroad. For men starved for any flavor that wasn't beef or beans, the intense, Fishy saltness was a welcome shock to the system, even if the quality was abysmal. It's a strange thought a cowboy in Wyoming, drinking a whiskey and eating a piece of pickled fish from the North Atlantic. The debate among historians, here is a fun one, was the free lunch a genuinely good deal for the customer? Or was it a clever scam on one hand? For a cowboy with only a few coins in his pocket, it was a way to get a hot meal or at least a lukewarm one for the price of a single drink. It was a form of social safety net, however greasy and unsanitary. On the other hand, saloon keepers knew exactly what they were doing. The food was intentionally made incredibly salty. The salt-cured meats, the pickled eggs, the salted crackers, all of it was designed to make you thirsty. You'd eat the free food, then you'd have to buy another beer to wash it down, then another. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of profit, a brilliant piece of commercial psychology. You look down at your plate. You have a cracker, a slice of the mystery meat, and a wobbly, translucent pickled egg. You take a bite of the egg. The white is rubbery, and the yolk is chalky and sulfuric. The whole thing saturated with a sharp, vinegary brine. It's not pleasant. It's a challenge. You wash it down with a swig of your lukewarm beer. The saloon is a microcosm of the West itself, a place of opportunity and desperation, where appearances are deceiving and survival often means not asking too many questions. The free lunch is its perfect culinary expression. It looks like a gift, a moment of generosity in a harsh world. But in reality, it's a transaction, a calculated risk. You're gambling that the calories you gain are worth more than the nickel you spent in the potential for a subsequent upset stomach. As you chew your salty, anonymous meat, you realize that even here, in civilization, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Your tour of the saloon's culinary offerings is not yet complete. Having cautiously navigated the free lunch, your attention is drawn to a different, more potent aroma emanating from a corner of the room. There, on a small, rickety table, sits a large, simmering cauldron. It's a cast iron pot, much like the Dutch ovens from the trail, and it's bubbling away over a low, charcoal brazier. This is the saloon's other main attraction, the perpetual stew, also known as the hunter's pot, or, more honestly, the one pusher all. For a few cents more than a beer, you can buy a bowl of this stew. The price is tempting, and the smell, while a bit strange, is undeniably more appealing than the cold, greasy offerings of the free lunch counter. You hand over your coins, and the bartender, without missing a beat in his conversation, grabs a tin bowl, dips a ladle into the murky depths of the pot, and hands you a steaming portion. You retreat to a relatively clean corner to examine your purchase. The stew is thick and dark, a brownish-red concoction with unidentifiable lumps of meat and vegetables floating in it. It's a stark contrast to the thin, watery stews of the trail. This one has body, it has a history. And that's the literal truth. The perpetual stew was a culinary tradition brought to America by European immigrants, a fixture in taverns and inns for centuries. The concept was simple: the pot was never emptied. At the end of the night, whatever was left in the pot was simply left to simmer. The next morning, new ingredients were added: water, scraps of meat, leftover vegetables, a handful of barley or beans, and the stew continued its endless existence. A stew you ate on a Thursday could contain molecules of a rabbit that was added on Monday. You take your first, hesitant spoonful. The flavor is surprisingly complex. It's deeply savory, with a multitude of layered tastes you can't quite decipher. There's a game, why not? Perhaps from a squirrel or rabbit. There's the familiar taste of potato and maybe some carrot. There's a definite hint of onion, but underneath it all is a deep, rich, almost funky base flavor, the taste of time itself. The contents of this pot were a direct reflection of the local economy of scraps. The saloon keeper would buy anything cheap. Trimmings from the butcher in the pot, leftover gravy from the free lunch meat in the pot, the heels of a loaf of stale bread in the pot, a handful of wild mushrooms a forager brought in the pot, Whatever game was in season, venison, duck, prairie dog, it all found its way into the communal cauldron. This mystery meat aspect was both its greatest weakness and its greatest strength. You never knew exactly what you were eating, which was unsettling, but the constant addition of new and varied ingredients is what gave the stew its unique, evolving flavor. Here's a particularly unsettling tidbit about the hygiene of such a dish. While the constant simmering would kill most active bacteria, these stews were a breeding ground for flavor compounds, some of which were on the border of spoilage. The term high meat refers to game that has been aged to the point of near putrefaction to develop a stronger flavor. A perpetual stew could, inadvertently, create a similar effect. That deep, funky, complex flavor you're tasting, it might be the result of a slow, controlled, multi-day fermentation process happening right there in the pot. It was a fine line between richly flavored and actively spoiling. The academic debate surrounding the perpetual stew is a fascinating one. Was it a safe and clever way to prevent food waste? Or was it a ticking public health time bomb modern food safety standards would, of course, condemn it instantly? But in the 19th century, before germ theory was widely understood, it made a certain kind of sense. The fire was never extinguished, the stew was always hot. In the minds of the saloon keeper and his patrons, this was enough to keep it clean. Historians argue about the actual health outcomes. Did these stews contribute to the frequent outbreaks of digestive ailments, the prairie colic and other mysterious stomach bugs that plagued frontier towns? It's almost impossible to prove a direct link. But it's hard to imagine that a stew containing days-old meat scraps was entirely benign. Yet, for thousands of people, it was a cheap, hot, and filling meal, and that often outweighed the potential risks. You find a chunk of meat in your bowl that is surprisingly tender. You chew it thoughtfully. Is it beef venison or the prairie dog you saw a kid carrying down the street earlier? You decide it's better not to know. The stew, for all its mystery, is warming your stomach and giving you a sense of satisfaction that the trail food never could. It's a gamble in a bowl. You finish your portion, leaving the bowl scraped clean. The perpetual stew is the ultimate expression of saloon cuisine, resourceful, economical, of questionable origin, and surprisingly tasty. It was a culinary melting pot in the most literal sense, a dish that told the story of the town's leftovers. As you place your empty bowl on the bar, you can hear the bartender chopping up some vegetables, ready to feed the beast in the corner, keeping it alive for another day, another dollar, another hungry customer. Feeling braver now, and with a few dollars still in your pocket, you decide to bypass the saloon's dubious offerings and seek out the source of the town's supplies, the general store. This establishment is the commercial and social heart of the community, a place that sells everything from nails and ammunition to fabric and, most importantly, food. You push open the door, and a bell jingles, announcing your arrival. The air inside is cool and smells of 100 different things at once: leather, coffee beans, molasses, and the dry, dusty scent of flour sacks. The shelves are packed to the ceiling with goods, creating narrow aisles that make the small space feel like a treasure cave. This, you think, is where the promise of a better meal lies. But a quick perusal of the shelves and the prices chalked onto a slate board quickly shatters that illusion. Civilization comes at a steep cost. The first thing you notice is the dominance of preserved and packaged goods. This is the kingdom of the can, the barrel, and the sack. Fresh food is almost non-existent. There's a barrel of sour pickles near the door and perhaps a box of wizened, sad-looking apples that have survived a long journey, each one costing a small fortune. But the bulk of the food is designed to endure. You see tall stacks of canned goods, a relatively new and miraculous technology. There are canned tomatoes, canned corn, and the holy grail of tinned food, canned milk. For pioneers and town dwellers alike, a can of condensed or evaporated milk was a taste of pure luxury, a way to have something creamy and rich for their coffee or in their baking. but the price is staggering. A single can might cost 25 or 50 cents, which was a significant portion of a day's wages for a common laborer. Then you see the staples. A large sack of flour, the kind cookie used on the trail, costs several dollars. A bag of sugar is even more expensive. A true luxury item reserved for special occasions. Salt, which was a cheap commodity back east, has its price inflated by the cost of transportation. Everything you took for granted is now a carefully considered purchase. You watch as a homesteader's wife trades her precious egg money, the small income she makes from selling her chickens' eggs, for a few pounds of flour and a small tin of coffee. Her movements are careful, her calculations precise. She barters for a few minutes, trying to get a slightly better price from the storekeeper, a man who knows he's the only game in town. Here's a little known fact about these general stores. The storekeeper was often the most powerful man in the community, more so than the mayor or the sheriff. He was the town's banker and creditor. Most transactions were not done in cash, which was scarce, but on credit. The storekeeper would keep a ledger, marking down what each family owed. He controlled the flow of goods and money. Then by extending or denying credit, he could literally determine whether a family survived the winter. This power was often abused, with storekeepers charging exorbitant interest rates and trapping homesteaders in a cycle of debt. The academic debate in this area is centered on the fairness of these prices. Were the high costs simply a reflection of the legitimate expenses of transportation and risk, or were they a result of monopolistic price gouging? The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the middle. The Transcontinental Railroad and its expanding network of spur lines were making it easier and cheaper to get goods to the west, but the final leg of the journey, from the railhead to a remote town via horse-drawn freight wagon, was still slow, dangerous, and expensive. Freighters had to be paid, goods were sometimes lost or damaged, and the storekeeper had to factor all of this into his pricing. However, there's no doubt that some storekeepers took advantage of their isolated customers' dependents, padding the prices to ensure a handsome profit. The line between a necessary markup and exploitation was a blurry one. You wander to the back of the store, where the meat is kept. There's no refrigerated butcher case. Instead, you find barrels of salt pork and a few large, dark, fly-covered slabs of salt-cured beef hanging from hooks. If you want meat, this is your option. You buy it by the chunk, and it's up to you to take it home. Soak it to remove the excess salt, and make it edible. The idea of buying a fresh, specific cut of meat, like a pork chop or a rump roast, is a fantasy. You finally decide on your purchase. You can't afford much. You buy a single, precious potato for a nickel. You splurge on a small handful of dried apples from an open barrel, paying an outrageous price for the shriveled, leathery rings, and you buy a small scoop of cornmeal. It's not a feast, but it's yours. You've paid for it with your own hard-earned money. As you leave the store, the bell jingling behind you, you have a newfound appreciation for the challenges of even the most settled life in the West. The struggle for food didn't end when you left the trail or the homestead. It just changed form. It became a battle of economics, a constant negotiation between desire and affordability. The general store, with its tantalizing but expensive goods, was the new frontier, and your dinner depended not on your foraging skills, but on the weight of the few coins in your pocket. You return to your small, rented room in the boarding house, clutching your meager purchases from the general store. You have a potato, a few dried apple rings, and a small bag of cornmeal. The challenge now is not just to cook them, but to make sure nothing, absolutely nothing, goes to waste. In a world without refrigeration, the battle against spoilage is a constant, daily war. Your kitchen is a shared stove at the end of the boarding house hallway. The landlady keeps a close eye on it, making sure no one uses more than their fair share of firewood. Here, you get a close-up look at the ingenious and sometimes desperate methods people use to preserve their food. The primary enemy is heat. The summer sun that beats down on the dusty town is relentless, and it will turn fresh meat or milk rancid in a matter of hours. The most common defense, as you know well from the trail, is salt. Salt curing was an ancient art, and in the West, it was a necessity. Meat was either submerged in a barrel of brine, a super concentrated saltwater solution, or dry cured by rubbing it with a thick crust of salt and letting it hang. This process draws the moisture out of the meat, creating an environment where bacteria cannot thrive. The salt pork and dried beef you saw in the store were products of this method. The downside, as you are painfully aware, is that it leaves the meat incredibly salty and tough, requiring hours of soaking to become even remotely palatable. Another common technique you see being used is smoking. A family who was lucky enough to hunt a deer or acquire a large cut of pork might build a small smokehouse, a simple wooden shed real low. Smoky fire could be kept smoldering for days. The smoke from hickory or mesquite wood would slowly dry out the meat while coating it with natural chemical compounds that acted as preservatives and added a deep, rich flavor. Smoked hams and bacon were prized possessions, a symbol of a well-stocked larder. For your own small treasures, the methods are simpler. Your dried apple rings are a perfect example of preservation through dehydration. Sliced thin and left out in the sun or near a stove, the fruit's moisture evaporates and its sugars become concentrated. The resulting leathery rings could last for months, providing a welcome burst of sweetness and vitamin C in the dead of winter. You chew on one now, and it's intense. Chewy sweetness is a marvel of simple food science. But what about fresh items, like milk or butter? This is where the ingenuity gets really interesting. Many households had a spring house, a small structure built over a cold spring. The naturally cool water flowing through would keep the stone-lined room at a low, stable temperature, acting as a primitive refrigerator. People would place crocks of milk and jars of butter in the cool water to keep them from spoiling. If you didn't have a spring, you might have a cellar, a root cellar dug deep into the earth where the temperature remained consistently cool year-round. This was the perfect place to store root vegetables like your precious potato, as well as carrots, turnips, and onions. Here's a truly weird preservation fact: people would sometimes preserve eggs by coating them in a layer of lard or submerging them in a solution of waterless sodium silicate. The lard would seal the pores of the eggshell, preventing air and bacteria from getting in. The waterless solution would create a syrupy, airtight barrier. These methods could keep eggs fresh for months, though the quality would degrade over time, with the yolks becoming runny and the whites thin. It was better than no eggs at all. The academic debate in this field often touches on the effectiveness of these methods and their impact on health. For example, was botulism, a deadly form of food poisoning caused by toxins from bacteria in improperly preserved foods. A common problem, the historical records are murky. Doctors in the 19th century wouldn't have diagnosed it as botulism, that they frequently recorded cases of sausage poisoning or ptomaine poisoning, with symptoms that sound suspiciously similar. The risk was very real. An improper leak in jar of vegetables or a poorly cured sausage could become a lethal weapon. Historians debate how widespread this knowledge was. Did the average homesteader's wife have a sophisticated, instinctual understanding of food safety, passed down through generations, or were they often just guessing and hoping for the best, with tragic consequences that went unrecorded? You decide to cook your potato. You boil it, skin and all, not wanting to waste a single scrap. While it cooks, you make a small portion of cornmeal mush. It's a meager meal, but you feel a sense of pride in it. You managed your resources, navigated the high prices of the store, and are now preparing a hot meal in your own small space. As you eat, you think about the sheer amount of labor and knowledge that went into every single bite of food in the Old West. It wasn't just about cooking, it was a constant, all-encompassing struggle against the forces of decay. Every meal was a small victory against time, heat, and microbes. The modern convenience of walking to a refrigerator and pulling out a carton of milk or a plastic-wrapped piece of chicken would have seemed like an impossible form of witchcraft. Your simple, bland meal of a boiled potato and mush is a direct result of that battle, a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of people who lived on the knife's edge of freshness and rot. You've been in the small cattle town for a few weeks now, subsisting on a diet of boarding house stews, the occasional saloon lunch, and whatever you can afford from the general store. The menu was a relentless rotation of preserved meat, cornmeal, potatoes, and bread. You haven't eaten a fresh vegetable in what feels like a lifetime. Then you're starting to feel strange. Your gums feel tender and swollen when you brush your teeth. The small cut you got on your hand last week isn't healing properly. You feel a deep, unshakable weariness in your bones that even a full night's sleep can't cure. Your joints ache. You complain about it to the old-timer at the boarding house, and he nods grimly. Got a touch of the scurvy, he says, as casually as if he were diagnosing a common cold. Scurvy, the word conjures up images of pirates on long sea voyages, not a cowboy in the dusty heart of America. But the truth is, this debilitating disease, caused by a severe deficiency of vitamin C, was a constant and serious threat on the American frontier. The classic cowboy and pioneer diet was almost completely devoid of the fresh fruits and vegetables that provide this essential nutrient. A person can store vitamin C in their body for a few months, but after that, if it's not replenished, the symptoms begin to appear. The disease is a slow, cruel breakdown of the body. Vitamin C is crucial for producing collagen, the protein that acts as the glue for your skin, blood vessels, and connective tissues. Without it, your body literally starts to fall apart from the inside out. It begins with fatigue and aching limbs. Then come the swollen, bleeding gums and loosened teeth. Old wounds can reopen. The new ones refuse to heal. The slightest bump can cause massive, dark bruises to appear on your skin. If left untreated, it leads to internal bleeding and, eventually, death. You look at the faces of the people around you in town. You notice the sallow complexions, the listlessness in their movements. You overhear conversations about prairie rheumatism and the leg aches, which were likely just colloquial terms for the chronic pain caused by scurvy. It was an invisible epidemic, a silent plague born of monotony. In their desperation, people in the West tried all sorts of strange and sometimes ineffective cures. One of the most common remedies, which you are now advised to try, is to eat raw potatoes. While potatoes do contain some vitamin C, much of it is destroyed by cooking. Eating them raw was thought to be more potent. You try it. You peel your precious, expensive potato and take a bite. The texture is crunchy, starchy, and unpleasant. It's a bitter medicine, but you sit down, hoping it will help. Here's a truly bizarre folk remedy. Some people believe that drinking the blood of a freshly killed animal could cure scurvy. The logic, while flawed, had a certain primal sense to it. They observed that predators who ate raw meat didn't seem to suffer from the disease. The truth is that organs, like the liver and adrenal glands, do contain small amounts of vitamin C. So, while it sounds gruesome, a desperate person who consumed the fresh organs of a hunted animal might have actually ingested enough vitamin C to alleviate their symptoms. The academic debate on this topic is fascinating. How aware were people in the 19th century of the link between diet and scurvy? The British Royal Navy had famously figured out that citrus fruits could prevent scurvy by the late 18th century. But this knowledge seems to have been lost, or at least not widely disseminated, in the American interior 100 years later. Many doctors of the era still subscribed to outdated theories, blaming the disease on bad air, dampness, or poor moral character. Some historians argue that folk knowledge was actually ahead of the medical establishment. The old wives' tales that recommended eating wild onions, rose hips, which are incredibly high in vitamin C, or the green shoots of prairie plants were, in fact, highly effective treatments, even if the people using them didn't understand the science behind it. The disconnect between official medical advice and practical, life-saving folk wisdom was often vast. The most effective, and most sought after, cure was simply to get your hands on some fresh produce. You see this desperation at the general store when a rare shipment of canned tomatoes arrives. A can of tomatoes, which retained a good amount of its vitamin C, became a prized medicine. People would buy a can and drink the juice straight, like a magic elixir. The sharp, acidic taste was the flavor of health itself. You decide to take matters into your own hands. You remember the prickly pear, cacti you saw on the trail. You walk to the edge of town and carefully harvest some of the red fruit. The tunas, you spend a painful hour scraping off the tiny spines, but you manage to gather a small bowl, if you will. You eat them raw. The sweet, vibrant pulpa, shocking and wonderful sensation. You also find some wild greens growing near a small creek what some call lamb's quarters. You gather a handful and eat them on the spot. You don't know if it will work, but as you walk back to town, your mouth still tingling with the fresh, wild flavors, you feel a flicker of hope. You've taken a small step to fight back against the creeping malaise. The experience is a stark reminder that in the Old West, food wasn't just about fighting hunger. It was about fighting a constant, invisible war against nutritional deficiencies. The most dangerous thing on the frontier wasn't always a rattlesnake or a bandit's bullet sometimes. It was the very food on your plate. Your brush with scurvy has left you with a new, heightened awareness of the hidden dangers in this environment. It's not just the food that can get you, it's the water. On the trail, you learn it to be wary of stagnant ponds and muddy streams. But here, on the edge of the great alkali flats, the danger is invisible, dissolved into the water itself. You've signed on for a short freight hauling job, moving supplies between your town and a remote mining camp. It's a multi-day journey across a landscape that grows progressively more barren and strange. The grass thins out, and the soil becomes pale and crusty in places, with a whitish powder dusting the surface. Your wagon boss, a grizzled man with a healthy sense of paranoia, gives you a stark warning as you fill your canteens from a clear, sparkling stream. Don't drink from just any water out here, he says, squinting at the horizon. Looks clean, but it can't tie your guts in a knot. He's talking about alkali water. This is a catch-all term for water that has a high concentration of dissolved mineral salts, like sodium carbonate, sodium sulfate, and magnesium sulfate, as water flows over certain types of soil and rock, especially in arid regions where there's a lot of evaporation. These minerals become highly concentrated. The resulting water can have a soapy, brackish taste and a pH that is highly alkaline, the opposite of acidic. For livestock, it could be deadly. Thirsty cattle would drink deeply from an alkali spring, and the high salt content would cause severe digestive distress, bloating, and often death. The landscape is littered with the sun-bleached bones of animals who made this fatal mistake. For humans, the effect is usually less lethal but still deeply unpleasant. Drinking alkali water acts as a powerful laxative and can cause severe cramping, nausea, and dehydration. In a place where water is already scarce, becoming dehydrated from drinking the wrong kind of water is a cruel and dangerous irony. You learn to read the signs. Your boss points out the telltale white residue on the banks of a waterhole, a clear sign of high alkali content. He shows you how to watch the wildlife. If you see animal tracks leading away from a water source without any signs of them drinking, it's a bad omen. The animals know. The most reliable method was simply to trust your tongue. You take a tiny, cautious sip. If it had that distinct, soapy, bitter taste, you'd spit it out immediately and move on, no matter how thirsty you were. This journey is a lesson in the geography of thirst. You begin to understand that all water is not created equal. You pass by beautiful, crystal clear ponds that are ecological traps, poisonous oases in the desert. Your survival depends on your ability to distinguish the good water from the bad. Here's a bizarre little known aspect of the water problem in the West. Sometimes the danger wasn't chemical, but biological in a very specific way. In certain areas, particularly in the high plains, water could be contaminated with a bacteria that caused beaver fever, now known as giardiasis. But even stranger was the risk of anthrax. Anthrax spores can lie dormant in the soil for decades. If an infected animal, like a bison or a cow, died near a waterhole, its carcass could contaminate the surrounding soil. During a heavy rain, these spores could be washed into the water. Anyone drinking that water could contract the deadly disease. It was a terrifyingly random threat, a microscopic game of Russian roulette. The historical debate here often revolves around how pioneers and travelers navigated this threat. Was it pure trial and error, a brutal process of natural selection, or did they have more sophisticated methods? Some historians argue that there was a robust system of information sharing. People would leave signs, a pile of rocks, a carved symbol on a tree to mark safe or unsafe water sources. Guidebooks and maps, when available, would often contain warnings about specific alkali springs, and the knowledge of local guides, particularly those with experience from Native American communities, was invaluable. The idea of a lone pioneer wandering blindly into the wilderness and surviving was rare. More often, they were part of a larger network of shared, hard-won information. One afternoon, your wagon gets bogged down in a muddy patch, and the delay costs you several hours. By evening, your canteen is nearly empty, and your throat is painfully dry. You come across a small, sluggish creek. There's no white residue on the banks, and the water doesn't have the telltale bitter taste. You and the wagon boss drink deeply, refiling your canteens with a sense of profound relief. That night, you are violently ill. You spend hours racked with cramps and sickness, and the wagon boss is no better. You didn't drink alkali water, but you drank something just as bad, water contaminated with animal waste and bacteria from upstream. It's a miserable, dehydrating, and humbling experience. You have been defeated by a glass of water. The next morning, weak and shaky, you climb back onto the wagon seat. The landscape, which yesterday seemed harsh but manageable, now feels actively hostile. You have a new respect for the fragility of the human body and the immense challenge of finding something as simple and essential as a safe drink. The West, you realize, could defeat you in 1,000 ways, and many of them were quiet, internal, and invisible to the naked eye. It was a world that demanded constant vigilance, not just about what you ate, but about the very water that gave you life. Your brief, unpleasant career as a freight hauler ends at the mining camp. It's a different world from the cattle town, grittier and more desperate. The men here are not cowboys dreaming of open ranges, but prospectors and miners, gambling their health and their lives for the slim chance of striking it rich. Their work is brutal, their living conditions are squalid, and their food is, if you can believe it, even worse than what you've experienced so far. You decide to stay for a while, taking a job doing odd tasks around the camp. This gives you a front row seat to the culinary life of two other major groups in the West, the U.S. Army soldier and the common miner. Their diets are dictated not by a chuckwagon cook or a homesteader's garden, but by official rations and the grim economics of a boomtown. First, let's look at the soldiers at the small fort that guards the mining district. You see the Army's supply wagons arrive, the official daily ration for a U.S. soldier on the frontier was, on paper, quite generous. It included 20 ounces of beef for 12 ounces of pork or bacon, 18 ounces of bread or flour, and various allotments of beans, rice, coffee, sugar, and salt. The problem was the massive gap between what was written on paper in Washington, D.C., and what actually ended up on a soldier's plate in a remote Dakota outpost. The beef was often as is, meaning it was driven to the fort on the hoof. These were not prime cattle. They were often old, tough animals bought for the lowest possible price. The fresh bread was a myth. Soldiers were given flour and had to bake their own, often resulting in the same dense, unpalatable hardtack you know so well, and the other supplies were frequently of abysmal quality. Unscrupulous contractors would sell the army rancid pork, insect-infested flour, and coffee beans that had been mixed with roasted acorns to add weight. Corruption was rampant in the army supply chain, and the soldier at the end of that chain paid the price. The miner's diet was, in some ways, even more precarious because it was entirely self-funded. A miner who had just struck a rich vein of silver might feast on canned oysters and champagne, bought at astronomical prices from the camp's single, monopolistic store. But for the vast majority of prospectors, who were barely scraping by, the diet was a grim exercise in caloric thrift. Their staples were the 3B's: beans, bacon, and bread. Sound familiar? It was the cowboy diet, but stripped of the luxury of a dedicated cook. A miner would often cook for himself over an open fire or on a tiny stove in his tent or shack. His breakfast would be bacon fried in a pan, with a biscuit cooked in the grease. Lunch, eaten down in the dark, dusty mine shaft, would be a cold bacon sandwich. Dinner would be a pot of beans, boiled with a chunk of the remaining bacon for flavor. It was a greasy, monotonous, and nutritionally barren existence. Here's a buzz or food that was surprisingly common in these remote camps: onions. Onions were relatively easy to transport and stored well, and they provided a much-needed blast of strong, savory flavor to the bland diet. More importantly, they were a source of vitamin C. Miners, who were just as susceptible to scurvy as cowboys, seemed to have an almost instinctual understanding of their value. An onion could be a prized possession, eaten raw like an apple. The demand was so high that an onion smuggler could make a small fortune by packing a mule with onions and selling them for $1 a piece in a remote camp. The academic debate here focuses on the comparison between these diets. Who had it worse, the soldier, the cowboy, or the miner? It's a grim contest. Historians argue that while the soldier's official ration was better on paper, the corruption and poor quality often made it just as bad as the others. The cowboy, at least, had the benefit of a dedicated cook and or relatively organized system. The miner, on the other hand, had the most freedom but also the most risk. His diet was a direct reflection of his success. A lucky miner ate well, an unlucky one subsisted on a diet that was barely enough to keep him alive, slowly succumbing to malnutrition and disease. There was no safety net. You see the grim reality of this in the faces of the men emerging from the mines at the end of their shift. They are caked in dirt, their bodies stooped with exhaustion. They trudge back to their shacks to perform the lonely ritual of cooking their meager meal. There's none of the communal campfire spirit of the cattle drive. It's a solitary, joyless process. You share a meal with one of them. He offers you a portion of his bean and bacon stew, served in a tin bowl that's stained with the ghosts of 1,000 previous meals. It tastes of salt, grease, and desperation. It is fuel, nothing more. It is the food of men who have traded all of life's small pleasures for a single, all-consuming gamble. As you eat, you realize that the story of food in the West is not one story, but many. It's a story of class, of occupation, and of luck. The food on your plate was a direct indicator of your place in the world. And here, in this bleak and hopeful mining camp, the food tells a tale of incredible hardship in the dog, perhaps foolish, persistence of the human spirit. The grim, monotonous diet of the mining camp has gotten to you. You find yourself craving not just fresh food, but a sense of purpose beyond simply surviving. You hear that a local rancher is organizing a large hunt to supply meat for the winter, both for his own family and to sell to the miners. Driven by a desire for a real piece of fresh meat to break from the drudgery, you sign on. This is your chance to participate in one of the most romanticized activities of the Old West, the Grand Hunt. You imagine yourself as a frontier hero, skillfully tracking a noble buck or a mighty bison, making a clean shot, and returning to camp as a celebrated provider. The reality, you will soon discover, is far less glamorous and far more pragmatic. The hunting party is not a group of sportsmen. It's a small, efficient team of workers. The rancher, a quiet man named Jed, is not interested in trophies or tales of bravery. He's interested in pounds of meat. The target is not the majestic deer or the iconic bison, whose numbers have already been decimated in this region. The target is anything that moves and is large enough to be worth the bullet. This could mean antelope, elk, or even bighorned sheep if they are lucky. You ride out from the ranch at dawn, into the high country. The air is crisp and cold. The hours pass in silence. The only sound the clap of hooves on rocky ground and the whisper of the wind through the pines. This is not a fast-paced chase. It's a slow, patient process of scanning the landscape, reading tracks, and trying to think like your prey. Your initial excitement gives way to a familiar boredom, punctuated by moments of intense focus. After hours of searching, Jed spots a small herd of antelope in a distant valley. The stalk begins. You dismount and spend the next hour crawling on your belly through sagebrush and dirt, your heart pounding in your chest. The romantic image of standing tall and taking a heroic shot is replaced by the gritty reality of trying to get close without being seen or smelled. You are a predator, and it is humbling. Dirty work. Finally, you are in position. The shots ring out, and 2 of the antelope fall. The rest scatter in an instant, vanishing over the ridge. There is no celebration, no whooping or hollering. The real work has just begun. This is the part that is always left out of the dime novels, the butchering. It is a messy, bloody, and physically exhausting job. The animals are field dressed immediately to cool the meat down and prevent spoilage. You're handed a knife and put to work. Under Jed's expert guidance, you learn to skin the animals. The hide peeling away from the muscle with a sickening, tearing sound. You learn to open the body cavity and remove the organs. The warm, metallic smell filling the air. It is a visceral, stomach-turning experience. Every romantic notion you had about hunting evaporates in the face of this brutal, biological reality. A very strange and specific hunting practice you learn about is creasing. This was a semi-mythical technique where a hunter would try to shoot a wild horse or a deer not to kill it, but to graze the top of its neck, right along the spinal cord. The bullet's impact would supposedly stun the animal and knock it unconscious long enough for the hunter to tie it up. It was said to be a way of capturing an animal alive. Most historians and firearms experts today are highly skeptical. The margin for error was impossibly small, a fraction of an inch too high, and the bullet misses, a fraction of an inch too low, and you kill or maim the animal. The debate continues whether creasing was a genuine, albeit rare, skill possessed by a few master marksmen, or if it was just a tall tale, a piece of frontier folklore that made for a good story around the campfire. The debate among historians about Western hunting often centers on the concept of conservation. Was there any sense of environmental stewardship among the hunters of the West? The popular image, fueled by the near extinction of the bison, is one of relentless, thoughtless slaughter, and in many cases, especially with market hunters who were paid by the piece. This was true. However, other historians argue that this paints an incomplete picture. Many long-term residents and ranchers, like Jed, had a vested interest in maintaining a healthy game population. They understood that if they wiped out the local elk or deer herds, they would lose a vital food source. They often practiced a form of informal conservation, choosing not to hunt during breeding seasons, unselectively targeting older animals. It was a conservation born of pragmatism, not ecological philosophy, but it existed nonetheless. By the time you have the meat loaded onto the pack mules, It is late afternoon. You are covered in blood and dirt. Your muscles ache, and you are bone tired. You ride back to the ranch under a sky turning orange and purple. There is a sense of accomplishment, but it is a grim, weary satisfaction. That night, you have your feast. Jed's wife pan-fries thick steaks of fresh antelope liver in bacon grease, with a side of fried onions. Liver was often the first part of the animal to be eaten, as it was highly nutritious and spoiled quickly. You sink your teeth into it. The flavor is rich, irony, and intensely savory. It is, without a doubt, the most delicious thing you have eaten since you left your old life behind. It tastes of the mountains, of the cold, clean air, and of your own hard labor. As you eat, you understand the hunt in a new way. It was not an adventure. It was a job. It was a messy, difficult, and necessary transaction between man and nature. A process of turning a living creature into life-sustaining calories. The romance was a fiction. The reality was blood, sweat, and a profound, undeniable taste of fresh meat. The success of the antelope hunt has filled the ranch's larder, but it has also opened your eyes to the sheer variety of what was considered game in the West. It wasn't just about the big, noble animals. In a world where protein was precious, the definition of edible was incredibly broad and often depended on how hungry you were. Back at the ranch, you watch as Jed and his family process the rest of the antelope. Nothing is wasted. The choicest cuts of meat are set aside to be sold or for special meals. The tougher, stringy parts are cut into thin strips to be made into jerky, just like on the cattle trail. The bones will be boiled for hours to create a thin, weak broth, which will be used as a base for future stews. Even the hide is carefully scraped and prepared for tanning. It's a masterclass in total utilization. But it's the discussion of past hunts and harder times that truly fascinates you. Jed tells you about the great bison hunts of a decade earlier. He speaks of them not with the bravado of a sportsman, but with the practical tone of a man who saw them as a walking grocery store. While the vast majority of the bison was often left to rot by commercial hide hunters, those who hunted for sustenance knew the value of every part. The most prized part of the bison, he tells you, was not the steak. It was the tongue. Bison tongue was considered an incredible delicacy. It was often smoked or pickled and was so popular that it was shipped back east in huge quantities. A luxury item on the menus of fancy restaurants in New York and Chicago. Another highly valued part was the hump, a large muscle above the shoulders that was rich in fat and incredibly tender. The rest of a 2-0-pound animal might be ignored by market hunters, but the tongue and hump were almost always taken. Then the conversation turns to leaner times, to the survival meats that people turned to when the deer and antelope were scarce. The list is a startling reflection of desperation. Rabbit and squirrel, which you've already encountered, were common fare, but people also ate badger, raccoon, and opossum. These were greasy, strong-flavored meats that required long, slow cooking to be made palatable. And then there were the animals that would make a modern diner's stomach turn. Prairie dogs, for instance. These small, burrowing rodents were abundant, and while they were small and hard to hunt, a stew made from a dozen of them could feed a family. The meat was said to be dark and have a taste similar to squirrel. Another surprisingly common food source in some areas was snake, particularly rattlesnake. The meat, once the snake was carefully skinned and devenomed, was said to taste as the old cliché goes a bit like chicken. It was oft unfried or added to stews. Perhaps the most grim and telling example of a desperation food was the prairie dog's neighbor, the burrowing owl. These small owls often lived in abandoned prairie dog burrows, and hungry settlers would sometimes eat them. However, there was a strange and widespread taboo against it. Many believed that eating an owl would bring bad luck, or that their mournful call was a bad omen. This bit of folklore is fascinating. It's a rare example of a food source that was available, but often avoided for purely superstitious reasons. a testament to the power of belief even in the face of hunger. This is a quirky little detail that shows how culture, and not just necessity, shaped the Western diet. The academic debate here is an interesting one. It centers on the concept of starvation food. At what point does a culture decide that a particular animal crosses the line from unconventional to inedible, for example? While prairie dogs were eaten, their close relatives, the gophers, were often avoided. While some people ate badger, very few would eat coyote or fox, which were seen as vermin or unclean animals. Historians and anthropologists argue that these lines are culturally constructed. They are not based on nutritional value or taste, but on a complex set of beliefs about an animal's habits, its symbolic meaning, and its perceived relationship to humans. The coyote, a cunning trickster in many mythologies, was simply not food, even when people were starving. The bison, a noble and powerful creature, was. The debate explores how these unwritten rules are formed and how they hold up under the pressure of extreme hunger. As you sit there, listening to these stories, you look at the haunch of antelope hanging in the smokehouse. It seems so clean, so straightforward in comparison. The conversation has given you a new perspective on the food you've eaten. The mystery meat in the saloons too suddenly seems less mysterious and more plausible. The resourcefulness of the homesteaders seems even more profound. You realize that the cuisine of the Wild West was not a set menu. It was a sliding scale of desperation. At the top of the scale were fresh beef and antelope, the food of the fortunate. At the bottom were rattlesnakes and prairie dogs, the food of those on the brink. Your own journey has taken you somewhere in the middle of that scale. You've eaten poorly, but you haven't truly starved. And for that, listening to these tales of true hardship, you feel a renewed and profound sense of gratitude. You've spent enough time at the ranch to see the seasons begin to turn. The relentless heat of summer is giving way to the crisp chill of autumn, and with the change in season comes a change that is far more profound and permanent than the weather. It arrives with a plume of smoke on the horizon and a sound that the old-timers still find unsettling, the whistle of a steam locomotive. The railroad is coming. For years, your small corner of the West has been an island, connected to the rest of the world only by slow-moving wagons and weary horses. The railroad changes everything. Overnight, the dusty track that construction crews have been laying for months is finally complete, connecting your remote region to the vast, industrial network of the East. And the first thing that rolls off those trains, after the meal and the passengers, is food. A different kind of food than you've ever seen here. You stand on the newly built platform of the town's small depot, watching a freight car being unloaded. It's a marvel of modern logistics. Workers are rolling out massive blocks of something you've only dreamed of: ice, cut from frozen lakes in the Sierra Nevada or the Midwest, packed in sawdust, then transported in insulated cars. Ice has arrived on the frontier. It is a miracle. Saloons immediately start advertising ice cold beer, a luxury so decadent it feels sinful. But its true impact is on the food supply. For the first time, fresh meat from a centralized packing house in a city like Chicago or Kansas City can be shipped west in refrigerated cars. This meat is from cattle breeds specifically raised for their tender, marbled flesh, not the tough, stringy longhorns of the trail. The local butcher shop is transformed. Suddenly, there are specific cuts available: pork chops, beef roasts, and real steaks. The era of relying solely on salted, dried, or freshly hunted meat is drawing to a close. But the even bigger revolution comes in a small, humble container: the tin can. Canned goods have been available before, but the railroad makes them cheap and abundant. The shelves of the general store, once a sad collection of expensive, random tins, are now overflowing with variety. You see canned fruits from California: peaches, pears, apricots, their bright, colorful labels promising a burst of summer sweetness. There are and vegetables: peas, green beans, asparagus offering a taste of green in the dead of winter. There are fish and seafood, salmon from the Pacific Northwest, oysters from the Gulf Coast. The world of food has suddenly expanded beyond the horizon. A miner in a remote camp can now eat peaches from California and salmon from Oregon on the same day. The monotony of the frontier diet is being broken. Debunking. A particularly curious and popular canned good was cove oysters. These were tiny oysters, steamed, packed in their own liquor, and sealed in a can. They were cheap and had a strong, salty, seafood flavor that was a complete novelty on the plains. They became a strange sort of status symbol. A classic fancy dish in a New Frontier hotel restaurant was oyster stew, a creamy, milky broth with a few of these rubbery little canned oysters floating in it. To a palate accustomed to beans and bacon, it was the height of sophistication. Of course, this technological leap forward had its doubters and its downsides. A subject of ongoing historical discussion, did the railroad truly improve the average person's diet on one hand? Absolutely. It introduced variety and crucial vitamins, likely reducing the incidence of scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies. It democratized luxury, making once unimaginable foods accessible. On the other hand, some historians argue that it also led to a dependence on processed, manufactured foods and a decline in local food knowledge. Why bother learning which wild greens are edible when you can buy a can of peas for a few cents? The reliance on canned goods, some of which were of questionable quality and packed with lead-based solder, introduced new health risks. Furthermore, the influx of cheap, mass-produced agricultural products from other regions often drove local homesteaders, who couldn't compete with the railroad's efficiency, out of business. The railroad was both a savior and a destroyer, a classic double-edged sword of progress. You experience this change firsthand. You buy a can of peaches. It feels heavy and solid in your hand, a small metal cylinder of pure potential. Back in your room, you open it with your knife, prying back the lid. The peaches are floating in a thick, sweet syrup. You spear one with your fork. It's soft, sweet, and tastes impossibly, wonderfully of summer. It is a flavor you had forgotten existed. The next day, the boarding house landlady serves us to that is different. It has the familiar base of potatoes and a bit of salted meat, but floating in the broth are the unmistakable bright green orbs of canned peas and the reddish chunks of canned tomatoes. The flavor is richer, more complex. Even the perpetual stew at the saloon seems to have been upgraded with the addition of canned vegetables. You are witnessing the end of an era. The culinary isolation of the West is over. The diet, for so long defined by scarcity, locality, and the desperate struggle for preservation, is now being shaped by the steam engine and the tin can. The food may not always be fresh, but it is varied and abundant in a way that would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. The grim, monotonous, and often terrible food of the Old West is being replaced by the merely mediocre, but miraculously diverse, food of a new, industrialized age. It doesn't feel as romantic, but it certainly tastes a whole lot better. The arrival of the railroad didn't just bring cans and ice, it brought people, waves of new immigrants, drawn by the promise of land, jobs, and gold, began to pour into the West, bypassing the long, arduous wagon journey of earlier pioneers, and with them, they brought their own languages, their own customs, and most importantly, their own flavors. Your town, once a homogeneous outpost of Anglo-American and Northern European settlers, is slowly transforming into a multicultural crossroads, and your plate is beginning to reflect that change. The first and most influential flavor to arrive comes from the South. Mexican families, whose ancestors had lived in this territory long before it was part of the United States, and new immigrants from Mexico, come to work on the ranches and railroads. They bring with them a culinary tradition perfectly suited to the arid landscape. You encounter it for the first time at a small food stall set up near the new depot, run by a woman and her sons. The air around the stall is filled with a smell you've never experienced before, the rich, earthy, and slightly fruity aroma of roasting chili peppers. She is selling simple, handmade tortillas, a bowl of beans that, unlike cookies, are swimming in a rich, red, chili-infused sauce, and small portions of spicy stewed meat. You buy a plate. The warmth of the soft corn tortilla, the creaminess of the beans, and the slow, blooming heat of the chili is a revelation. It's not just seasoning, it's a whole new language of flavor. This is the origin of what will one day be called Tex-Mex, born from the fusion of Mexican ingredients and Anglo tastes. Next, you encounter the influence of German immigrants. A new butcher shop opens in town, run by a stout, cheerful man with a thick accent. He doesn't just sell salted meat, he makes sausage. He uses scraps of pork and beef, grinds them with spices he had shipped from back home, caraway, marjoram, and pepper, and stuffs them into casings. The result is bratwurst and other sausages, which he smokes or sells fresh. For a community used to tough, stringy meat, the taste of a juicy, flavorful sausage, served with a side of sauerkraut he ferments in a large crock, is a minor miracle. The most isolated and perhaps most fascinating culinary influence comes from the Chinese immigrants, brought in by the thousands to do the dangerous and back-breaking work of building the railroad. They often live in their own separate, marginalized communities, in a small, makeshift Chinatown on the edge of town. They open their own restaurants and grocery stores, catering to their own people. Curiosity gets the better of you, and you venture into one of these small establishments. The menu is completely alien. You seem then eating bowls of steaming white rice, a grain you've never seen prepared this way, with stir-fried vegetables and small pieces of meat. The flavors are a complex mix of salty soy sauce, sharp ginger, and pungent garlic. It is a sophisticated, vegetable-forward cuisine that stands in stark opposition to the heavy, meat and starch diet of the frontier. They have managed to recreate the flavors of their homeland, using a combination of imported dried goods and whatever fresh produce they can grow in small, meticulously tended gardens. A particularly interesting dish that highlights Chinese ingenuity is egg foo young. This Chinese omelet was likely invented in America, a perfect fusion dish. It used a familiar ingredient, the egg, but mixed it with whatever vegetables or meat scraps were available, like bean sprouts, cabbage, or chopped pork, and covered it in a thick, savory sweet brown sauce. It was a resourceful and delicious way to stretch ingredients and appeal to both Chinese and American palates. The academic debate here is poignant. How much did these foreign cuisines actually influence the mainstream Western diet at the time, while we now see these flavors as integral to American food? Historians argue that in the 19th century, the cultural exchange was very limited. Anglo-Americans might have occasionally eaten at a Mexican food stall or a Chinese restaurant out of curiosity, but for the most part, these food cultures remained separate, confined to their own communities. The widespread adoption of things like chili, tacos, and stir-fries was a 20th century phenomenon. In your time, these flavors were often viewed with suspicion and prejudice, seen as exotic or unclean by the dominant culture. The melting pot was simmering, but it had not yet begun to truly melt. You sit at a table in the German butcher's shop, eating a sausage on a hard roll. At the next table, a group of Mexican taqueros are laughing over their chili-spiced beans. Down the street, the scent of ginger and garlic wafts from Chinatown. The food of the West is no longer a single, monotonous story. It is becoming a collection of stories, a chorus of different voices and different tastes. For you, it is a delicious and welcome change. The arrival of these new flavors is like a splash of vibrant color in a black and white world. It is a sign that the frontier is not just expanding, but also diversifying. The terrible food of the Old West is not just being replaced by cans and ice, it's being challenged and enriched by the traditions of the people who are coming to build its future. The bland, lonely prairie is starting to taste like the world. The town is booming. The railroad, the mines, and the ranches have brought a level of prosperity that would have been unimaginable just a year ago. To celebrate this newfound success and to formally mark its transition from a rough-and-tumble outpost to a proper, civilized community, the town's leading citizens decide to host a grand 4th of July celebration. This, you are promised, will be a feast to remember, a culinary showcase of the New West. The entire town buzzes with preparation for weeks. The women's church auxiliary plans the desserts. The ranchers pledge to donate the meat, and the saloon keepers agree to provide the drinks. It's a massive, communal effort to put the bad old days of hardtack and sowbelly firmly in the past. You get swept up in the excitement, volunteering to help set up the long trestle tables in the town square. On the morning of the 4th, the square is a hive of activity. The centerpiece of the feast is the barbecue. This isn't the slow-smoked, sauce-slathered barbecue of the American South. This is Western-style barbecue, a tradition born of necessity on the ranches of California and Texas. A massive pit has been dug in the ground, and a whole side of beef, donated by the wealthiest rancher, has been slowly cooking over hot coals all night long. The smell of roasting meat fills the entire town, a primal and universally understood signal of celebration. The tables groan under the weight of the food. It's a stunning panorama of the West's new, hybrid cuisine. You see enormous bowls of potato salad, a dish brought by German immigrants, creamy and rich with mayonnaise made from precious and milk and eggs. There are platters of the German butcher's finest sausages, sitting alongside plates of fried chicken, a dish beloved by settlers from the southern states. You see massive pots of beans, but these are not the sad, watery beans of the trail. These are barbecue beans, a sweet and tangy concoction made with molasses, vinegar, and chunks of bacon. It's a dish that elevates the humble bean from a survival staple to a celebrated side dish. And the bread. There are no dense sourdough discs or tooth-breaking hardtack in sight. Instead, there are baskets piled high with soft, fluffy yeast rolls, a testament to the new availability of reliable commercial yeast. There are loaves of fresh-baked bread and, most impressively, towering, multi-layered cakes baked by the women of the town. These cakes are a true status symbol, showcasing a family's ability to afford the expensive sugar, butter, and flour required to create such a confection. A truly bizarre but popular celebratory dish you might see at such an event is a calf's head soup or a mock turtle soup. To make it, a calf's head was boiled for hours until all the meat fell off the bone. The meat, tongue, and even the brains were then chopped up and added to a rich, seasoned broth, often thickened with flour and flavored with a splash of sherry or Madeira. To modern sensibilities, it sounds grotesque, but in the 19th century, it was considered a sophisticated delicacy, a sign of a truly continental feast. The academic debate around these celebrations is interesting. Were they a genuine reflection of a new, abundant food culture, or were they a carefully constructed performance of prosperity? Some historians argue that these feasts were a form of culinary theater. For one day, the community would pool its resources to create an illusion of endless bounty, a powerful piece of propaganda to send back east, encouraging more investment and more immigration. The reality for most people, on most days, was still a much simpler, more meager diet. This feast was the exception, a day-long fantasy, not the everyday rule. It was less about what people actually ate and more about what they aspired to eat. You fill your plate, a mountain of food that would have been unthinkable just a few months prior. You have a slice of the pit roasted beef, which is tender and smoky. You have a scoop of the sweet barbecue beans, a dollop of potato salad, and a soft yeast roll. You wash it down with lemonade, made with real lemons and real ice. A drink so luxurious, it feels like nectar. You look around the square. You see cowboys, miners, ranchers, and merchants, all sitting together, their faces flushed with food and sun. You see the Mexican families, the German butcher, and even a few of the Chinese railroad workers, standing at the edges of the crowd, observing the strange American ritual. It's a portrait of the West in transition. For dessert, you have a slice of apple pie, but it's not the mock apple pie made with vinegar and crackers. This one is made with real apples, sorts from the new orchards in Oregon and shipped in on the train. The taste is pure, sweet, and authentic. As you eat, you reflect on your long culinary journey. You have gone from the grim survivalism of the chuckwagon to the desperate ingenuity of the homestead, from the mystery meat of the saloon to the gritty rations of the mining camp. And now, you are here, in the midst of a celebration of abundance. The terrible food of the Wild West has not vanished, but it has been buried under a landslide of progress. This feast is a declaration of victory over scarcity, over monotony, and over the harsh, unforgiving land itself. The grand feast of the 4th of July was a turning point, a public declaration that the town had arrived. But the true, quiet revolution in the Western diet wasn't happening in the barbecue pits or on the groaning trestle tables of a public festival. It was happening in the small, fenced-in patches of dirt behind the houses, the kitchen gardens. After the celebration, you find yourself with a more permanent and pleasant job, working as a handyman for one of the town's more prosperous merchants. His wife, a determined and resourceful woman named Mrs. Gable, has made it her personal mission to cultivate a proper garden. This is not the desperate, scraggly plot of the homesteader, struggling to produce a few potatoes. This is a planned, ambitious project, a small square of civilization carved out of the dusty backyard. You spend your days helping her. You till the soil, removing the rocks and stubborn prairie grass. You help build a fence, not just to keep out stray dogs, but to act as a windbreak against the relentless prairie wind. You help her dig irrigation ditches, channeling precious water from the town's well to her thirsty plants. It's hard work, but it feels different. It's not about desperate survival, it's about cultivation, about creating something new. Mrs. Gable is a general in this small war. She has ordered seeds from catalogs back east, exotic varieties that have never grown in this soil before. You plant rows of lettuce, spinach, and radishes, vegetables that grow quickly and promise the taste of crisp, fresh greenness. You plant carrots, beets, and onions, and most importantly, you plant tomatoes. The tomato plant, once feared by many Americans who thought it was poisonous, it belongs to the nightshade family, has become the darling of the kitchen garden. It's hardy, productive, and its fruit is incredibly versatile. The garden is not just for vegetables. Mrs. Gable has a section for herbs. You carefully plant sprigs of mint, parsley, sage, and thyme. These are the flavors of refinement, the small, subtle notes that can transform a simple piece of meat from mere sustenance into a proper dish. The aroma of crushed mint or fresh parsley after months of smelling only dust and bacon grease is intoxicating. This movement was a uniquely female-driven frontier. While the men were out ranching, mining, or running businesses, the women were in charge of the domestic sphere, and the kitchen garden was their domain. It was a space where they could exercise control, creativity, and scientific knowledge. They traded seeds with their neighbors, exchanged tips on how to deal with pests, and experimented with which varieties grew best in the harsh local climate. Magazines and almanacs from the East provided advice, creating a network of shared knowledge that connected these isolated women. Here's a peculiar but important detail about these gardens: flowers were often planted right alongside the vegetables. Marigolds, for example, were not just for decoration. Gardeners believed correctly, as modern science has confirmed, that their strong scent helped to repel harmful insects and nematodes in the soil. Sunflowers were another common sight. They provided beauty. Their seeds could be roasted and eaten, and their tall stalks could serve as a natural trellis for climbing beans. The garden was a complex, symbiotic ecosystem, a blend of practicality and aesthetics. The academic debate here centers on the social impact of these gardens. Were they simply a source of food, or did they play a larger role in the civilizing of the West? Many historians, particularly those focused on women's history, argue that the kitchen garden was a profoundly important social and cultural space. It was a way for women to assert their identity and values in a male-dominated world. It was a project that brought beauty, order, and a sense of permanence to a transient and chaotic environment. Tending a garden was an act of faith, a belief in the future. It demonstrated that you weren't just passing through, you were putting down roots, both literally and figuratively. Weeks pass, and the garden begins to yield its bounty. The first harvest is a handful of radishes. Mrs. Gable washes them, slices them thin, and serves them with a little salt and fresh butter on a slice of bread. You take a bite. The peppery, crisp crunch is a jolt to your senses. It's the simplest of foods, but it feels like the most luxurious thing you've ever eaten. Soon, there are fresh salads on the dinner table, made with tender lettuce leaves and a simple vinaigrette. There are bowls of steamed carrots and buttered beets. The stews are no longer just meat and potatoes. They are filled with fresh onions, carrots, then celery, and flavored with parsley and thyme from the garden. The kitchen is transformed. It becomes a place of creativity, with a steady supply of fresh ingredients. Mrs. Gable can experiment. She cans her own tomatoes, makes her own pickles, and creates jams from the berries that grow on the bushes she planted along the fence. The house is filled with the smells of a productive, bountiful kitchen. You realize that this small plot of land represents the true end of the old frontier diet. It's not the railroad or the general store that ultimately defeated the tyranny of the bean and the biscuit. It was the quiet, patient, and determined work of women like Mrs. Gable, who, one seed at a time, brought color, flavor, and life back to the Western table. The garden is a promise fulfilled, a testament to the idea that with enough hard work and a little bit of water, even the most stubborn patch of prairie could be made to bloom. You are sitting at the Gables' dinner table, enjoying a meal that would have been pure fantasy a year ago. On your plate is a tender piece of roasted chicken, seasoned with thyme from the garden. Next to it is a scoop of fluffy mashed potatoes and a vibrant medley of steamed green beans and carrots. The flavors are clean, fresh, and delicious. This meal is a symbol of the New West, a world of settled domesticity and agricultural abundance. As you eat, you find yourself thinking about the journey you've taken and the foods that defined it. It's a strange kind of nostalgia. You certainly don't miss the taste of hardtack or the endless pots of bland beans, but you realize that those very hardships gave birth to some of America's most iconic and beloved food traditions. The terrible food of the Old West didn't just disappear, it evolved. Consider the barbecue you had on the 4th of July. That tradition of digging a pit and slow cooking a large cut of meat over coals wasn't invented for a party. It was born out of the necessity of feeding a large group of vaqueros or cowboys at a cattle roundup. It was the most efficient way to cook a tough piece of beef from an old steer and make it tender and palatable for a crowd. The simple salt and pepper rub and the slow cooking process were a direct result of the limited ingredients and equipment available. Today's elaborate barbecue sauces and fancy smokers are a direct descendant of that primitive, practical cooking method. Then you think about chili, or chili con carne. The dish you tried at the Mexican food stall has become a local sensation, with several saloons and eateries now offering their own versions. The origins of this dish are a perfect example of frontier fusion. It combines the chili peppers and spices of Mexican cuisine with the cheap, tough cuts of beef that were readily available in places like San Antonio, Texas. It was a hearty, flavorful, and inexpensive way to feed laborers and cowboys. The chili queens of San Antonio would sell it from open-air stalls, and it quickly became a legendary dish. What began as a humble peasant's stew, a way to make tough meat edible, has now started its journey to becoming a national obsession. Even the simple act of putting beans on the side of everything has its roots in the chuckwagon. The beans were always there, a cheap and reliable source of bulk and protein. As the main courses got better, evolving from salted pork to fresh steak, the beans stayed, a familiar and comforting presence on the plate. They transitioned from being the main event to being the quintessential sidekick of every Western meal. Here's a fascinating example of culinary evolution: the cowboys' sourdough biscuit. That dense, heavy, but life-sustaining bread, cooked in a Dutch oven, is the direct ancestor of the modern pan-fried or skillet bread and even some forms of cornbread. The principle of using a heavy cast iron pan to create a crusty, delicious bread is a technique honed over 1,000 campfires. The sourdough starter itself, that precious pet of the trail cook, has seen a resurgence in modern artisan baking, celebrated for the complex flavors it creates. The historical debate here is about authenticity. What makes a dish like chili or barbecue authentic? Purists might argue that real Texas chili should never contain beans, or that real barbecue must be cooked in a certain way with a certain type of wood. But historians would argue that the most authentic thing about these foods is their history of adaptation. They were never static recipes. They were constantly evolving, shaped by the ingredients at hand, the people who were cooking them, and the economic realities of the time. Chili was born from making do. Barbecue was born from making do. The very essence of this cuisine is its resourcefulness. To freeze it in time and declare one version authentic is to miss the entire point of its history. You finish your meal and Mrs. Gable offers you a dessert, a slice of bread pudding. It's made from leftover, stale bread, soaked in a sweet custard made with eggs and canned milk, and spiced with cinnamon. It is, in its own way, a perfect metaphor. It takes something old, stale, and undesirable, the bread of yesterday's struggles, and transforms it into something new, sweet, and comforting. This is the ultimate fate of the terrible food of the Wild West. It didn't just vanish. It was transformed by time, by prosperity, and by the relentless ingenuity of cooks. The harshest survival tactics became beloved culinary traditions. The dishes born of desperation became sources of regional pride. The story of Western food, you realize, is not about a sudden leap from terrible to terrific. It's a story of slow, delicious evolution, a process of turning hardship into heritage, one bite at a time. The ghosts of the chuckwagon and the sod house kitchen are still here, hiding in your bowl of chili and on your barbecue plate, a faint, smoky taste of the past that made the present possible. The years have been kind to you. The small, dusty town you arrived in is now a respectable city with paved streets, a 2-story brick courthouse, and multiple churches. The Gables have become like family, and you've built a comfortable life for yourself. The wild, open frontier of your youth has been tamed, fenced in, and civilized. One crisp autumn afternoon, you find yourself walking past the town's new museum, a modest building dedicated to preserving the history of the county. In the front window is a new exhibit, Pioneer Life. Your curiosity piqued. You step inside. The exhibit is a collection of artifacts from the old days, which to you don't feel so very old. There's a rusty plow, a spinning wheel, and a collection of faded photographs of stern-faced men and women. But what stops you in your tracks is a display case in the center of the room. Inside, resting on a piece of faded red velvet, is a single, perfectly preserved, yellowish-brown disc. The label reads hardtack, circa 1870, a staple food for pioneers and cowboys. You stare at the biscuit. It looks exactly as you remember, dense, lifeless, and utterly unyielding. You can almost feel the jarring impact on your teeth. Taste the bland, flurry paste it becomes when soaked in bitter coffee. A group of school children is gathered around the case, their faces pressed against the glass. IWW. They ate that, one of them whispers, a mixture of disgust and fascination in their voice. Their teacher, A young woman who wasn't even born when you were riding the trail begins to explain, in a soft, academic voice, the nutritional challenges of westward expansion. You feel a strange sense of dislocation, of becoming a living artifact yourself. The food that was your daily reality, your struggle, your private misery, is now a historical curiosity, an object of study behind glass. You wander over to another part of the exhibit, which recreates a corner of a chuckwagon. There's a soot-blackened Dutch oven, a massive coffee pot, and a few tin plates. You see the sacks, labeled beans and flour. It's a sanitized, sterile version of the real thing. There's no dust, no grease, no lingering smell of wood smoke and stale bacon. It's a memory without the feeling, a story with the hard parts smoothed over. This experience highlights a final, fascinating academic debate: the romanticization of the past. How and why do we transform a history of hardship into a source of entertainment and nostalgia? Historians and sociologists call this process myth-making. The grim reality of the Western diet, the scurvy, the monotony, the new starvation is glossed over in popular culture. It's replaced by the myth of the hearty cowboy feast, the sizzling steak, and the cheerful cook. Why? Because the myth is more comforting. It's more entertaining. It reinforces a national identity built on strength, abundance, and self-sufficiency, even if the historical reality was one of vulnerability and dependence. The hardtack behind the glass is no longer a symbol of suffering. It's a symbol of the rugged endurance that built the nation. You leave the museum and walk to the town's newest and most popular restaurant, the Prairie Rose. It's a themed restaurant, decorated with wagon wheels, cowboy hats, and old photographs. The menu is a modern American interpretation of Western food. You can order a Trail Boss T-bone steak, a Sword-Out Jack burger, or a Gold Rush chili bowl. You order the chili. It arrives in a polished ceramic bowl, topped with a dollop of sour cream, a sprinkle of fresh cilantro, and a pile of grated cheddar cheese. It's rich, flavorful, and delicious. It bears only a passing resemblance to the gritty, desperate stews you once knew. This isn't survival food. This is entertainment. You look around the restaurant at the families and couples, happily eating their authentic Western meals. They are consuming a story, a carefully packaged and palatable version of the past. The terrible food of the Wild West has completed its final transformation. It has become a brand. As you eat your delicious, inauthentic chili, you don't feel angry or resentful. You feel a quiet sense of peace. You lived through the reality, and you are grateful to have survived it. You are happy to let others enjoy the myth. The journey from a stale biscuit in the dust to a gourmet chili in a comfortable restaurant is the story of your life and the story of the West itself. You have, at West, said your final goodbye to the hardtack era. The world has moved on, and so have you. The flavors of the past have been preserved, but they have been tamed, refined, and made safe. The struggle is over. All that is left is the taste, a faint, lingering echo of a hunger you will never have to feel again. The day fades into a soft, quiet evening. The meal is finished. The story is told. Your journey through the culinary wilderness of the American West is complete. You have tasted the grit, the salt, the desperation, and the slow, blooming hope of a changing world. From the endless beans of the trail to the first miraculous taste of a canned peach, you have walked the long road from survival to sustenance, from sustenance to civilization. The ghosts of that time feel very far away now, their struggles softened by the mists of history. The hard edges have been worn smooth, leaving behind only the strange, comforting weight of memory. The world you now inhabit, with its easy abundance and endless variety, was built upon that foundation of hardship. Every fresh vegetable, every clean glass of water, every warm slice of bread is a quiet monument to those who lived without them. And now, it's time to let that world drift away. Let the images of dusty trails and crackling campfires dissolve into the soft darkness behind your eyes. The low hum of the fan becomes the whisper of prairie wind, a gentle sound to guide you toward rest. There are no more cattle to drive, no more rivers to cross. There is only the stillness of the night and the promise of a peaceful sleep. You are safe, you are comfortable, and your pantry is full. Let that gratitude be the last thought that carries you into your dreams. The end of the article. Good night.